Fall asleep to hysterical history. The Simulation Theory, Roughing It in the Matrix, by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1. The Great Humbug of Reality. I have lived a long time, long enough to see the world change from a place where a man could trust his own eyes to a place where a man can hardly trust his own trousers. In my youth, a rock was a rock. A river was a muddy inconvenience. And if you hit your thumb with a hammer, the resulting profanity was directed at a solid, physical universe that had the decency to be there when you struck it. But nowadays, we have these scientists, a breed of men who possess the uncanny ability to take a perfectly simple fact and dress it up in so much mathematical millinery that its own mother wouldn't recognize it. These gentlemen of the high brow and the deep pocket have come to a conclusion that would make a Mississippi card sharp blush. They suggest, with a straight face no less, that this whole spectacle, from the glitter of the stars to the itch in your Sunday flannels, is nothing more than a simulation. They reckon we are all living inside a grand celestial telegraph machine, or perhaps a series of complicated weaving looms, operated by a civilization so far advanced that they have nothing better to do than watch us make fools of ourselves for their digital amusement. Now, a simulation is just a college-educated word for a humbug. It's a theatrical production where the scenery is painted so convincingly that the audience forgets they're sitting in a drafty hall on hard wooden benches. And I must admit, as I look out over the river of time, there are moments when the paint starts to peel and the stage hands can be heard swearing behind the curtain. The stagecraft of the stars. Consider, if you will, the sheer perfection of the world. It is too perfect by half. If you find a gold watch in the middle of a desert, you don't assume it grew there like a cactus. You assume some fellow with a waistcoat and a lack of direction dropped it. The universe is a very fine watch indeed. The stars are hung with such precision that a sailor can find his way home by them, and the seasons arrive with the punctuality of a man looking to collect a debt. In the old days, we called this providence. We figured there was a grand architect who enjoyed woodworking and had a particular fondness for beetles, seeing as he made so many of them. But the modern simulists, as I shall call them, for lack of a more insulting term, reckon the architect isn't a carpenter at all, but a programmer. They suggest that instead of sawdust and cedar, the world is built of bits. To the layperson, that is to say, the sensible person who doesn't spend his night staring at Greek letters until his brain turns to mush, a bit is simply a yes or a no. It's the click-clack of the telegraph, a 1 or a 0. These fellows argue that if you zoom in close enough on the fabric of reality, past the skin, past the muscle, past the atoms which look like tiny solar systems, you eventually run out of stuff and find only information. It is a terrifying thought. It means that if you were to take a magnifying glass of sufficient power to your own grandmother, you would eventually discover she is not made of cookies and kindness, but of a very long string of mathematical instructions. It's enough to make a man lose his appetite. The three-card Monte of existence. One of the chief proponents of this nonsense is a fellow named Bostrom. He's a philosopher, which is a profession that involves thinking very hard about things that don't exist, until they do. He has proposed a trilemma, which is a fancy way of saying a three-way choice where every exit leads to a headache. He argues thusly: either civilizations go extinct before they get smart enough to build a universe in a box, or they get smart enough, but they lose interest in playing God. Perhaps they take up fly fishing instead. Or we are, right this very minute, living in such a box. He reckons that if any civilization ever reaches the point where they can run a simulation of their ancestors, they won't just run one. They'll run thousands. They'll run them for history projects, for entertainment, or perhaps just to see what would happen if they made a version of Earth where the French won the Battle of Waterloo. Statistically speaking, and statistics are the crutches of men who cannot walk by logic alone, this means there are millions of fake universes and only one real one. If you're a betting man and you find yourself holding a hand of cards in a room with 1,000,000 players, the odds that you are the only real person at the table are slim enough to slide under a locked door. The lazy creator and the glitch. But why would anyone believe this? What is the evidence for this grand deception? The simulists point to what they call optimization. If you were building a world on a budget, and even a god must surely have some sense of economy, you wouldn't bother rendering the parts that nobody is looking at. It's like a theater company that only paints the side of the house facing the audience. When you walk behind it, it's just 2x4s and old canvas. They say the universe does the same thing. They call it quantum mechanics, which is a term designed to make you feel like an idiot so you won't ask questions. They claim that light behaves like a wave when you're looking elsewhere, but as soon as you turn your head to catch it in the act, it snaps into a particle. It renders, as the computer boys say. It's as if the great programmer is trying to save on his electricity bill by only turning on the lights in the room you're currently standing in. Then there are the glitches. We've all seen them. You find your keys in the refrigerator, or you see a man in a crowd who looks exactly like your Uncle Silas, even though Silas has been planted in the churchyard for 20 years. We used to call these miracles, or ghosts, or the results of a third bottle of bourbon. But the simulists say these are just bugs in the code. They reckon the universe occasionally stutters, and for a brief second, the illusion slips. A matter of perspective and vanity. The most irritating thing about this whole theory is the vanity of it. Man has always wanted to be the center of the story. First, we thought the sun went around the earth. Then we thought we were the pinnacle of creation, hand-carved out of the dust. Now we think we're so interesting that some super-intelligent race of future humans has spent an unthinkable amount of energy just to simulate us sitting in traffic and complaining about the weather. It reminds me of a man I once knew in Hannibal who was convinced he was the subject of a secret biography being written by the King of Sweden. He spent his whole life acting with a certain regal posture, waiting for the biographers to jump out from behind a bush. He died penniless and unbiographed, but he had a wonderful time being important in his own mind. Whether we are real or simulated seems to me a distinction without a difference. If I am a collection of bits, I am a very hungry collection of bits, and I require a very real-tasting steak to satisfy my simulated stomach. If the world is a humbug, it is a magnificent one, and I tip my hat to the programmer. He has captured the smell of rain on hot pavement and the sound of a woman's laugh with a fidelity that no human artist could ever hope to match. The verdict of the porch. As we set sail on this literary voyage, I invite you to leave your certainties at the dock. We are going to look at the math, the physics, and the sheer absurdity of our existence. We shall examine the evidence for the code and the arguments for the clay. But let us do so with a wink, for if we are indeed living in a simulation, the worst thing we could do is be boring. If there is a great programmer watching us, let's give him a show worth the price of admission. Let us be the most vivid, stubborn, and unpredictable bits of data in the whole machine. I reckon that if the universe is a lie, it's a big, beautiful, thumping lie, and I've always had a soft spot for a good storyteller. So, let us see how the story is told, and perhaps we'll find that the truth is just a word we invented to make ourselves feel better about not knowing the punchline. Onward, then, into the digital fog, and mind the gaps in the rendering. I've heard the edge of the world is a long way down, and the graphics at the bottom are terrible. Chapter 2. It, from Bit, the Celestial Telegraph. I once spent a rainy Tuesday in a printing house in St. Louis watching a young apprentice set type for the morning edition. The lad was a marvel of concentrated clumsiness, but as I watched his ink-stained fingers dance among the lead blocks, a thought struck me. A thought so heavy it nearly required a crane to lift it. If you look at a newspaper from across the street, you see a grand tapestry of human folly. A war in some place you can't spell, a sale on corsets, and a local politician promising to stop stealing long enough to get reelected. It looks like a solid sheet of truth, but if you walk right up to it and peer through a magnifying glass, the truth dissolves into a million little dots of black ink. The lady in the corset disappears, and you're left with nothing but a series of "is it there" or "is it not there" smudges on a field of cheap pulp. Our modern men of science, the fellows who wear white coats to hide the fact that they've forgotten how to button their own shirts, claim the universe is exactly like that Sunday supplement. They call this notion information physics. It is a grand, highfalutin way of saying that the world isn't made of stuff at all, but of answers. The man with the rolling pin name. There was a philosopher-physicist by the name of John Wheeler, a man whose name suggests he should be fixing wagons, yet whose mind was occupied with the plumbing of the cosmos. He coined a phrase that has since become the battle cry of the simulists. It from Bit. Now, to a sensible person, an it is something you can kick, like a stubborn mule or a politician's shins. A bit, on the other hand, is what you put in a horse's mouth to make him go where he doesn't want to. But in the lexicon of the Great Humbug, a bit is the smallest possible scrap of information. It is the yes or the no, the light or the dark, the on or the off. Wheeler's argument is that every it, every star, every blade of grass, every unpaid bill, is ultimately derived from these bits. He suggests that the universe doesn't start with matter and then decide to have information. It starts with information and then decides to look like matter. It is as if the universe is a giant game of 20 questions, and the physical world is just the prize you get at the end for guessing right. Every physical quantity, every it, derives its ultimate significance from bits, binary choices, bits which we call yes or no, true or false, 0 or 1. The gospel according to Wheeler. The cosmic Morse code. To understand this for the lay public, which is a polite term for people who have better things to do than solve equations, we must look to the telegraph. When Samuel Morse sat down to invent a way for people to lie to each other across vast distances, he didn't send whole words through the wire. He didn't shove a "Dear Aunt Sally" through the copper and hope for the best. He broke the world down into dots and dashes. A dot isn't a word, and a dash isn't a sentiment, but if you arrange enough of them in the right order, you can declare war or propose marriage. The It from Bit crowd reckons the Creator is the most industrious telegraph operator in history. They claim that an atom isn't a solid ball of something or other, but rather a collection of clicks and clacks. When you sit in a chair, you aren't sitting on wood. You are sitting on a very dense congregation of yeses. The chair is shouting, "I am here," at your backside in binary code, and your backside is politely replying, "I believe you," in the same language. Table, the celestial translation. The real world, the it. The digital underworld, the bit. A glass of whiskey. A billion trillion yes/no questions about fluid dynamics. A summer rainstorm. A massive data dump from the atmospheric server, your mother-in-law. A particularly complex and undeletable set of instructions. The Mississippi River. A continuous stream of bits flowing toward a saltwater database. The problem of the stuff. The trouble with this theory is that it offends a man's dignity. We like to think we are substantial. We like to believe that if we eat a ham sandwich, there is hamness and breadness involved. But the information physicist will tell you with a straight face that the ham is just a packet of data, and the bread is just the interface. They claim that matter is just a convenient fiction, a sort of shorthand for our brains. It's like a banker who looks at a ledger. He doesn't see gold coins, he sees numbers. He knows the gold exists somewhere, at least he hopes it does. But for the purposes of doing business, the numbers are the reality. The information physicists are the bankers of the universe, and they've decided to stop worrying about the gold and just focus on the ledger. This leads us to a terrifying conclusion. If the universe is made of information, then the universe is computable. And if it's computable, someone, somewhere, might just have a computer big enough to run the whole show. The second law of infodynamics, or why the universe hates a mess. There is a newfangled law being tossed around in the ivory towers of 2025 called the second law of infodynamics. It sounds like something that would require a permit to discuss, but it boils down to this. Information likes to be tidy. In the physical world, things tend toward disorder. If you leave a barn alone for 50 years, it doesn't turn into a palace. It turns into a pile of rotten timber. That's entropy. But in the world of information, things like to be optimized. They like to be compressed. Think of a telegram. You don't write, "I am writing to inform you that I am currently experiencing a state of being that is quite well, and I hope you are also in a state of being that is well." You write, "All well, send money." You compress the information to save on the cost of the wire. The simulists argue that the universe shows signs of this cosmic compression. Why are the laws of physics the same everywhere? Why is the speed of light a hard limit? Because the programmer is trying to save on processing power. If every star had its own set of rules, the great machine would overheat and melt the cosmic motherboard. By making everything follow the same simple rules, the programmer can run 1 billion galaxies for the price of one. The verdict of the magnifying glass. I find it hard to argue with a man who has a telescope in one hand and a calculator in the other, but I cannot help but feel that we are being sold a bill of goods. If I am just a bit, I am a remarkably stubborn one. I have opinions that no machine could ever calculate and a capacity for making mistakes that would crash any computer ever built by mortal hands. However, we must admit that the it from bit theory explains a great deal. It explains why the world seems so mathematical. It explains why we can describe a sunrise with an equation. It's because the equation came first, and the sunrise was just the output. As we move forward, we shall see how this celestial telegraph handles the more complicated parts of life, the parts that don't fit neatly into a 1 or a 0. We shall look at the pixels of reality and see if we can spot the brushstrokes of the Creator. But for now, remember, the next time you look at the moon, don't be fooled by its silvery glow. It's just a massive collection of yeses hanging in a no of a sky, waiting for someone to ask it a question. I'm going to go have a simulated cigar. It may only be a string of binary code, but I reckon if I believe in it hard enough, the smoke will still make me cough. Chapter 3. The Bostrom Gamble. I have always maintained that the most dangerous place for a man of limited means and unlimited optimism is a riverboat poker game. There is something about the smell of cigar smoke and the rhythmic thumping of the paddle wheel that makes a man believe that the next card dealt will be the one to redeem his character and restore his bank account. But even the most desperate gambler on the Mississippi, holding a pair of deuces and a hope for a miracle, is a piker compared to a fellow named Nick Bostrom. Bostrom is a philosopher at Oxford, a place where, I am told, the fog is so thick that the inhabitants are forced to think deep thoughts just to find their way to the dining hall. Mr. Bostrom has laid out a wager that makes a high-stakes game of faro look like a Sunday school picnic. He calls it his trilemma, but I prefer to call it the Bostrom Gamble. It is a three-way split of the future, and if he's right, the odds are that you, me, and the chair you're sitting on are about as real as a politician's promise. The 3 cards on the table. Bostrom steps up to the table, adjusts his spectacles, and deals out 3 possibilities for the fate of humanity. He argues, with the cold, unfeeling logic of a man who has never had to sweat for a living, that at least one of these 3 things must be true, the gone-to-glory option. Civilizations like ours almost always go belly up before they reach what he calls a post-human stage. This means we either blow ourselves up with some newfangled gunpowder, get eaten by a plague of our own making, or perhaps just forget how to farm and starve to death while staring at our reflection in a pond. In this scenario, nobody ever gets smart enough to build a universe in a box. The bored with godhood option. Future civilizations get the technology to run simulations of their ancestors, but they simply don't care to. Perhaps they've evolved past the need for entertainment, or maybe they've realized that watching their great-great-grandfathers argue about the price of coal is about as exciting as watching paint dry in a damp cellar. The We are the show option. We are currently living in a simulation run by those very descendants. Now, if you're a betting man, you might think option 1 or 2 sounds reasonable. We humans have a remarkable talent for self-destruction, and I've certainly met people I wouldn't want to simulate once, let alone 1,000 times. But Bostrom's trap is in the math. The logic of the nested box. The crux of the gamble is this: if option 1 and 2 are false, if we survive and we keep our curiosity, then we will eventually build computers so powerful they can simulate an entire world down to the last whisker on a cat. And we won't just build one. Human nature being what it is, we'll build millions. We'll build them for history classes so students can see the Battle of Gettysburg without the risk of getting shot. We'll build them for scientists to see what happens if the sun were made of green cheese. And we'll build them for children to play with on a rainy afternoon. If there are millions of ancestor simulations and only one original reality, what are the odds that you are the lucky fellow in the original? It's like being one of a million pebbles in a bucket and betting your life that you're the only one made of real granite while the rest are painted wood. You'd be a fool to take that bet, and even a bigger fool to win it. The vanity of the original. It is a blow to a man's pride to think he is a rerun. We like to believe we are the pioneers, the first ones to walk this particular stretch of mud. We want to be the base reality, the solid ground upon which all other shadows are cast. But Bostrom suggests that our very existence as a technological civilization is a sign that we're in the middle of a stack of pancakes. If we are on the verge of creating our own simulations, it stands to reason that someone else has already done it to us. It's a hall of mirrors that goes on until the light fails. I can hear the objections already. But Mark, you say, I feel the sun on my face. I taste the salt in my soup. Surely a machine cannot simulate the exquisite misery of a toothache. To which I reply, have you ever had a dream where you fell off a cliff? Your stomach did a somersault, your heart hammered against your ribs like a trapped bird, and you woke up in a cold sweat. For those few seconds, that cliff was as real as the bed you were lying in. A computer that can simulate a brain can simulate a toothache, and it can do it with such fidelity. Another one of those $10 words that you'd never know the difference until the programmer hits the clear button. The ethics of the great simulator. This leads us to a darker thought, one that would make a man want to keep his hat on and his doors locked. If we're a simulation, what kind of fellow is running the machine? Is he a benevolent historian carefully watching us to learn from our mistakes? Or is he a bored teenager in the year 4000 who has decided to see what happens if he turns up the global pandemonium dial just to see the funny faces we make? In the old days, we worried about the will of God. We wondered why a merciful creator would allow boils, taxes, and the opera. But in the Bostrom Gamble, the will of God is replaced by the interest of the researcher. If we become boring, does the researcher turn us off? If we solve all our problems and live in perfect harmony, do we lose our entertainment value and get deleted to make room for a more exciting simulation of the Black Death? It gives a man a powerful incentive to be interesting. I've always said that if you're going to be a sinner, be a spectacular one. If we are bits in a machine, let's be the bits that make the processor smoke. The conclusion of the coin toss. Whether Bostrom is a genius or just a man who has spent too much time in dark rooms with flickering screens is a question for the ages. But his gamble forces us to look at our world through a different lens. It suggests that our reality is not a fixed thing, but a fluid one. It suggests that we are part of a grander chain of being than we ever imagined, even if that chain is made of silicon and copper rather than golden links. As for me, I reckon I'll keep playing the hand I've been dealt. If I am a simulation of a 19th century writer, I shall endeavor to be the most authentic, cantankerous, and witty simulation in the entire database. If the programmer is watching, I hope he's enjoying the show, and if he isn't, well, the whiskey still tastes real enough to me, and that's a comfort that no amount of logic can take away. We are all gamblers at this table, my friends. We've bet our souls on the idea that the ground won't vanish from under our feet. Bostrom just had the audacity to point out that the table itself might be a ghost. Chapter 4. Steamboats and Supercomputers. In my tenure as a pilot on the Mississippi, I came to understand that a steamboat is not merely a collection of timber, iron, and vanity. It is a living, breathing, cantankerous beast with a soul as temperamental as a jilted duchess. When you stand in the pilot house of a grand palace like the Pennsylvania, you aren't just steering a boat. You are presiding over a symphony of mechanical violence. Below your feet, the boilers are screaming, the pistons are churning with the rhythm of a giant's heartbeat, and the paddle wheels are thrashing the muddy water into a lather of white fury. To the simple folk on the shore, a steamboat was a miracle. They saw it move against the current without the help of God or a favorable wind, and they figured it was magic. But to the engineer, in the bowels of the ship, it was nothing but a series of if-then statements written in brass and steam. If the pressure rises too high, you open the safety valve. If the water gets too low, you pump in more, or you prepare to meet your maker in a cloud of splinters and scorched linen. Our modern simulists look at the universe through much the same lens, though they've replaced the smell of coal smoke with the sterile hum of the supercomputer. They argue that if a machine of iron can mimic a horse, then a machine of silicon can mimic a soul. And if a machine can mimic a soul, then perhaps the soul itself was a machine all along. The grandeur of the gear. In the 19th century, we were quite certain we had reached the pinnacle of complexity. We had clocks that could tell you the phase of the moon and the day of the week, provided you didn't mind winding them until your fingers bled. We had analytical engines, theoretical contraptions of brass gears and punch cards that could supposedly do math faster than a school teacher on a Friday afternoon. We believed that if you built a machine complicated enough, it would eventually wake up and ask for a cigar. We saw the universe as a giant clockwork, wound up by a divine watchmaker and left to tick-tock its way through eternity. It was a comforting thought. It meant the world was solid. It meant that if you took a gear out of the world, the whole thing would grind to a halt. But the supercomputer has ruined all that. A computer doesn't have gears. It doesn't have pistons. It doesn't have anything you can kick when it stops working. It is a world of invisible lightning moving through silicon, which is just a high-flown word for very expensive sand. The jump from a steamboat to a supercomputer is a jump from the physical to the virtual. A steamboat occupies space. It has a draft, a weight, and a tendency to snag on sandbars. A computer program, however, occupies no space at all. You can fit 1 million simulated steamboats inside a box the size of a trunk, and the box won't weigh an ounce more than it did when it was empty. The mimicry of the machine. The simulist's argument rests on a very shaky foundation called functionalism. It's the idea that if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and pays its taxes like a duck, then for all practical purposes, it is a duck. They say that the human brain is just a very wet, very messy computer. They reckon your thoughts are just electrical signals jumping across gaps, like a series of tiny telegraph operators sending messages back and forth. If we can build a machine that does the same thing, if we can map out every click and clack of the human mind, then the resulting being inside the machine wouldn't know it was a machine. It would remember its first kiss. It would feel the sting of a cold wind. It would worry about its weight and its soul. And if that simulated fellow feels real to himself, who are we to tell him he's just a collection of if-then statements written in a language of ones and zeros? This is where the snark of the universe truly shines. We spent centuries trying to build machines that look like us, and now we've succeeded so well that we're starting to suspect that we look like them. It's as if a man spent his whole life carving a wooden puppet, only to have the puppet turn around and ask him where his strings are hidden. The scale of the great calculation, the sheer gall of the supercomputer is what gets my goat. A modern machine can perform quadrillions of calculations in the time it takes you to blink. They call this petaflops, which sounds like a particularly clumsy breed of dog. But it actually means the machine is thinking faster than every human being who ever lived, combined. If you have that kind of power, you don't just simulate a steamboat. You simulate the river. You simulate the mud in the river. You simulate the microscopic creatures living in the mud who are currently wondering if they, too, are part of a simulation. The simulists argue that the only thing stopping us from simulating a whole universe is processing power. They reckon that in another 100 years, we'll have machines so powerful that they could run a simulation of the year 2026 with such detail that the people inside would be writing books about whether they are in a simulation. It's a nested humbug. It's a box inside a box inside a box, and eventually you realize that nobody knows where the original box went. The engineer's dilemma. I remember an engineer on the city of Memphis who was convinced he could hear the boilers talking to him. He'd put his ear to the iron and say, "She's feeling a bit weary today, Sam. She's got a grumble in her second flue." We all laughed at him, of course. We knew the boiler wasn't feeling anything. It was just metal and fire. But if the universe is a simulation, then that engineer was the only sane man on the boat. He recognized that the machine has a character. He saw that the rules of the system, the pressure, the heat, the friction, were the real authors of the journey. The difference between my old steamboat and the supercomputer is that the steamboat had the decency to explode when it reached its limit. It gave you a clear, loud, and final no. The supercomputer, on the other hand, just sits there humming quietly while it creates entire worlds out of nothing but math. There is a quiet horror in that. If the world is a machine, then it is a machine that doesn't need us to run it. It doesn't need us to stoke the fires or oil the gears. It just calculates. We are not the pilots of this reality. We are merely the passengers. And I suspect The great programmer hasn't even bothered to check our tickets. The verdict of the boiler room. As we move out of this first part of our voyage, this setting sail into the digital fog, we must carry this thought with us. The line between machine and nature is getting thinner than a politician's skin. In the next part, we shall look at the evidence for the great code. We shall see if we can find the pixels in the Mississippi and the glitches in the stars. But for now, take a look at your own hand. Is it made of flesh and bone, or is it a very high-resolution rendering of flesh and bone? I reckon it doesn't matter much. As long as your hand can still hold a glass of whiskey and turn the pages of a book, the how of it is a secondary concern. But if you start to hear a quiet humming coming from the floorboards, or if you see a man walk through a wall and then vanish into a puff of blue light, don't say I didn't warn you. The great steamboat of reality might just be a very fancy piece of software, and the stop button is somewhere we can't reach. Onward, then. The river is wide, the water is deep, and the code is written in a language that would make a mule driver weep with frustration. Chapter 5. The Law of the Lazy Creator. I have always had a profound and abiding respect for a truly lazy man. There is a certain majestic economy in a fellow who can find a way to do 12 hours of work in 20 minutes, or better yet, not do it at all and still collect the wages. My friend Tom Sawyer was a master of this craft. He turned a drudgery like whitewashing a fence into a privilege so sought after that he had a line of boys paying him for the honor of doing his chores. That is not just laziness, that is genius. It appears, according to the latest bulletins from the frontiers of physics, that the architect of the universe, be he a bearded patriarch in the clouds or a bored teenager at a glowing console, is cut from the very same cloth. The gentlemen in the lab coats have discovered what they call the second law of infodynamics. It sounds like a law that would get you a heavy fine if you broke it in a public park, but it actually describes a curious habit the universe has. It hates to repeat itself, and it loves to cut corners. If the universe were a writer, it would be the kind that uses a lot of et ceteras to avoid describing the scenery. The editor, with the heavy red pen. In the physical world, we have the second law of thermodynamics. It's a dismal rule that says everything is slowly turning into a lukewarm puddle of nothing. If you leave a pristine deck of cards on a table and blow on them, they will scatter into a mess. They will never, of their own volition, arrange themselves back into suits and numerical order. That is entropy, the universe's tendency to become a disorganized shambles. But there is a fellow named Melvin Vopson, a man who clearly spends his time looking at the world through a digital loop, who claims that when it comes to information, the rule is reversed. In a digital system, or a simulated one, information doesn't like to get messy. It likes to be compressed. It likes to be tidy. Imagine you are writing a telegram to your wife to tell her you've been delayed because the river has risen and the boat has run aground on a sandbar near Dubuque. A physical man would describe the mud, the shouting of the captain, and the specific shade of brown of the water. But a man paying by the word, a compressed man, simply writes, stuck, late, send ham. Vopson argues that the universe is constantly sending ham. It is stripping away the unnecessary bits to keep the system running lean. The symmetry shortcut. The most damning evidence for this lazy creator theory is the sheer amount of symmetry in the world. Look at a snowflake or a starfish, or the face of a particularly handsome politician. One side is almost exactly like the other. Now, if you were building a universe from scratch with infinite energy and no deadline, you might make every leaf on every tree entirely unique. One leaf shaped like a star, another like a fish, another like a miniature map of Ohio. But that is a lot of work. It's much easier to write one small piece of code for half a leaf, and then simply tell the computer to mirror it. The simulists call this code reuse. In the world of computer games, if you're building a forest, you don't design 10,000 different trees. You design 3 very good ones, and then copy and paste them all over the hillside, rotating them a bit so the players don't notice the humbug. When we look at the mathematical patterns that repeat throughout nature, the Fibonacci sequence in a sunflower, the fractals in a lightning bolt, we aren't seeing the hand of God. We're seeing the copy-paste function of a programmer who wanted to get to lunch early. The efficiency of the void. There is a principle in science called Occam's razor, which suggests that the simplest explanation is usually the right one. I've always preferred TwAIn's razor, which suggests that the explanation involving the least amount of walking is the one people will choose. The second law of infodynamics suggests that the universe is trying to minimize its information entropy. This is a fancy way of saying it wants to describe the most amount of stuff with the least amount of code. Consider the electron. Every electron in the entire universe is identical to every other electron. They have the same mass, the same charge, the same sour disposition. Why? If the universe were a collection of unique physical objects, you'd expect some variation. A heavy electron here, a cheerful electron there. But if the universe is a simulation, it makes perfect sense. There is only one piece of code for an electron, and the simulation just runs multiple instances of it. It's like a book where every character named John is exactly the same man, wearing the same hat and saying the same 3 sentences. It's not great literature, but it certainly saves the author a lot of thinking. The processing power problem. Why would a creator be so lazy? Why not go for the full, uncompressed director's cut of reality? The answer, as any man who has ever tried to run a steam engine on damp wood knows, is resources. Even a supercomputer in the year 4000 must have a limit to its power. If you try to simulate every single atom in the universe as a unique, independent entity, the machine will start to smoke, the fans will whir like a hurricane, and the whole thing will eventually crash, which I suspect is what happened during the Dark Ages. By compressing the information, by using laws of physics that apply everywhere, by reusing shapes, and by only rendering the parts we are currently looking at, the programmer can keep the frame rate high and the electricity bill low. The comfort of the corner cutter. Some people find this idea depressing. They feel cheated, as if they've been sold a solid oak table that turns out to be nothing but cheap pine with a clever veneer. They want a universe that is real, all the way down to the basement. But I find it strangely comforting. It means that the universe is rational. It means that the great engineer is a practical fellow who values efficiency over vanity. And it means that if we are indeed part of a simulation, we are part of a very well-managed one. A lazy creator is a predictable creator. He isn't going to suddenly change the rules of gravity on a whim, because that would require rewriting the core engine, and that's just too much work. We can rely on the sun to rise and the rain to fall not because of a divine promise, but because the programmer has already saved those settings and he's lost the password to change them. So, the next time you marvel at the perfect design of a nautilus shell or the miraculous consistency of the laws of physics, don't get too puffed up about the grandeur of it all. Just remember, it's likely that someone, somewhere, found a shortcut, and we are the beneficiaries of his desire to take a nap. I reckon that if I ever meet the programmer, I won't ask him about the meaning of life or the nature of the soul. I'll just ask him for his tips on how to get the most out of a copy-paste command. A man can always stand to learn a new way to be effectively idle. Chapter 6. Pixels on the Mississippi. I recall a time in New Orleans when I was invited to the parlor of a very wealthy, very bored widow who had recently acquired a painting from the continent. She claimed it was a masterpiece of the pointillist school, a term that in those days meant the artist had a very steady hand and a very small brush, or perhaps a very nervous disposition. From across the room, the painting was a marvel. It showed a sunset over a hayfield with such luminous beauty that you could almost feel the evening chill and smell the damp earth. But being a man of a naturally suspicious and prying nature, I walked right up to the canvas until my nose was nearly touching the varnish. The sunset vanished. The hayfield evaporated. In their place was nothing but a senseless, dizzying sea of tiny colored dots. There wasn't a single sun or blade of grass in sight, only a million little stabs of the brush, each one meaningless on its own, yet conspiratorially arranged to deceive me from a distance. The modern professors of the infinitesimal tell us that the entire universe, the mountains, the oceans, and the very air we breathe to complain about them, is exactly like that widow's painting. They claim that if you zoom in far enough on reality, the smoothness of the world disappears, and you find the pixels of the Creator, the floor of the universe. In my day, we were taught that space was like a fine silk, continuous, elegant, and capable of being divided into smaller and smaller pieces until you reached the very hem of nothingness. We figured that if you took a yard of string, you could cut it in half, then half again, and keep on cutting until the pieces were so small they'd make a flea look like a mountain, and you'd still have room to cut some more. But the scientists of the 20th and 21st centuries, men who apparently have nothing better to do than try to break things that aren't even there, have discovered that the universe has a floor. It has a minimum size. You cannot, it seems, have a piece of space smaller than what they call the Planck length. Now, don't ask me to write out the number. It involves a decimal point followed by so many zeros that by the time you finished reading it, your beard would be dragging on the floor, and your grandchildren would be asking for their inheritance. It is 1.6 times 10 to the minus 35 meters. To give you an idea of the scale, if an atom were expanded to the size of the entire solar system, a Planck length would be about the height of a blade of grass on a lawn in St. Louis. The digital grain. Why does this floor exist? If the universe were natural, whatever that word means anymore, there would be no reason for a minimum size. A real physical world should be infinitely divisible. You should be able to zoom in forever and always find more space. But a simulation cannot afford such luxuries. Any boy who has ever played with a magnifying glass near a modern television screen knows that the picture is made of little squares. We call them pixels. If the pixels are small enough, your eye is fooled into seeing a smooth curve or a soft shadow. But if you get too close, the illusion breaks. The curve becomes a staircase. The shadow becomes a grid. The Planck length is the pixel size of our reality. The reason you can't have anything smaller is the same reason you can't have half a pixel on your computer screen. The system isn't built to handle it. The code of the universe is written in discrete steps. Space is not a silk sheet. It is a very fine, very tight mesh of digital tiles. The processing savings of a grainy world. Now, you might ask why the great programmer would bother making the world grainy at such a small scale. Why not make the pixels so small they truly are infinite? The answer, once again, is economy. If space were infinite and continuous, then to calculate the position of even a single dust mote, the computer would have to deal with infinite numbers. And as anyone who has ever tried to balance a checkbook knows, infinity is a very difficult thing to put into a column. By quantizing space, by breaking it into little fixed blocks, the programmer makes the math manageable. He turns the universe into a massive, three-dimensional checkerboard. It is far easier to calculate a move from square A to square B than it is to calculate a move through an infinite, bottomless void. By giving the universe a minimum resolution, the programmer ensures that the simulation doesn't crash every time a hummingbird flaps its wings. The jitters of the small. When you get down to the level of these pixels, things start to get very strange. They call this quantum foam. In the world we inhabit, the world of steamboats and sandwiches, things stay where you put them. If I leave my hat on a table, I expect to find it there in the morning unless the cat has taken an interest in it. But at the Planck scale, the pixels of space are constantly flickering, popping in and out of existence like the static on a badly tuned radio. The simulists argue that this flickering is simply the background noise of the processor. It's the sound of the machine humming as it works. If you look too closely at the code while it's running, you're going to see some rendering artifacts. The quantum foam is just the universe's way of saying, stop looking at the brushstrokes and get back to the gallery. The humiliation of the magnitude. There is something deeply humbling and slightly irritating about being told that the solid earth beneath your feet is just a high-resolution humbug. We walk around thinking we are part of a grand flowing narrative, when in fact we are just aliased edges in a very complex calculation. We are like the characters in a cheap novel who think they are living through a tragedy, unaware that they are only made of 26 letters and a handful of punctuation marks. I once knew a man who tried to invent a microscope for the soul. He spent his life grinding lenses of such purity that he claimed he could see the very atoms of human thought. He went mad, of course. He ended up sitting in a corner, mumbling about how it's all just dots, Sam. It's all just dots. I used to think he was crazy. Now, After reading the latest bulletins from the physics department, I suspect he was simply the only man among us who had actually seen the masterpiece for what it truly was. The verdict of the dot. If the universe has a minimum size, it means the universe has a limit. And anything with a limit is, by definition, a designed thing. Nature doesn't use minimums, only engineers do. So, the next time you admire the infinite beauty of a starlit night, remember that it isn't infinite at all. It's just very, very high resolution. The stars are fixed to the same grid as your thumb, and the vast distances between them are just a very large number of Planck lengths. It doesn't make the stars any less bright, and it doesn't make the river any less muddy. But it does suggest that we are living inside a work of art that was built on a budget. And as a man who has spent much of his life trying to make a little bit of talent look like a great deal of genius, I can't help but admire the hustle. The programmer has sold us a smooth reality, and we've bought it hook, line, and sinker. We've been staring at the colored dots and calling them a sunset for thousands of years. I reckon the joke is on us, but at least it's a beautiful joke, provided you don't look too closely. Keep your magnifying glasses in your pockets, my friends. Some things are better left at a distance. If you go hunting for the pixels, you might just find that there's no you left to see them. Chapter 7. The Speed Limit of Light. I have always been a man who appreciates a certain degree of haste, provided I am not the one doing the hurrying. I have lived through the era of the stagecoach, which moved with the agonizing deliberation of a glacier with a limp, and I have seen the coming of the express train, which rattles a man's teeth so thoroughly that he forgets his own name by the time he reaches the next county. In my piloting days, speed was a matter of pride and physics. If you could coax an extra knot out of a boiler without scattering your passengers across the treetops of Arkansas, you were a hero. But in the grand silent reaches of the cosmos, it appears there is a speed limit so strict, so uncompromising, and so utterly baffling that it makes the most stone-faced constable in Connecticut look like a man of loose morals. I am speaking, of course, of the speed of light, a brisk 186,282 miles per second. The men of science call it c, perhaps because they were too exhausted by the calculation to finish the word celerity. They tell us that nothing in this universe, not a beam of light, not a radio wave, and certainly not a politician fleeing a scandal, can go 1 inch faster. The cosmic speed trap. To the average fellow, the one who spends his time worrying about the price of eggs rather than the curvature of space-time, the speed of light seems plenty fast. You flip a switch, and the room is bright. You don't have to wait for the light to come trudging down the hallway like a delivery boy with a heavy package. But why is there a limit at all? In a real, physical, old-fashioned universe, you'd reckon that if you pushed something hard enough, it would just keep going faster. If you're on a train going 60 miles an hour and you throw a baseball forward at 60 miles an hour, the ball is going 120. That is common sense. But if you're on a spaceship going nearly the speed of light and you turn on a flashlight, the light doesn't go double speed. It stays right at C. Einstein, a man whose hair was clearly trying to escape his head at the speed of light, discovered that as you get closer to this limit, the universe starts to behave like a mule that's decided it's had enough of the plow. Time slows down, and you get heavier. It's as if the universe is shouting, "Slow down, you fool! You're going to break the furniture. The processing speed of the heavens. The simulists have a very simple, very cheeky explanation for this cosmic speed trap. They say the speed of light isn't a law of nature at all. It is the clock speed of the hardware running our world. Think of it this way. If you are playing a game of cards on a computer, the computer can only process the moves as fast as its processor allows. It can only move the digital cards across the screen at a speed dictated by the internal ticks of its clock. No matter how hard you click the mouse, the machine can only update the picture so many times a second. The speed of light is simply the speed at which information can be transferred from one pixel of the universe to the next. If the great programmer tried to let things move faster than C, the game would start to lag. You'd see the stars flickering, the planets would stutter in their orbits, and eventually the whole blue screen of death would descend upon the heavens. The latency of the stars. We like to think that when we look at the stars, we are seeing the world as it is right now. But that is a humbug of the highest order. Because of the slow speed of light, we are always looking into the past. When you look at the sun, you're seeing it as it was 8 minutes ago. If the sun were to suddenly vanish, perhaps to take a much-needed vacation, we would go on blissfully enjoying the sunshine for 8 whole minutes, unaware that the central heater of our solar system had been turned off. When we look at a distant galaxy, we are seeing light that started its journey before the first man ever figured out how to use a spoon. In the world of the supercomputer, they call this latency. It is the delay between a command and the result. The universe has a built-in lag of about 300,000 kilometers per second. It's as if the great programmer lives in a very large house, and it takes him a long time to walk from the kitchen to the parlor to tell us what's for dinner. Human experience, cosmic reality, the lag, a flash of lightning, a 0.00001 second delay in rendering, seeing the moon, a 1.3-second-old save file, looking at Andromeda, a 2.5-million-year-old rerun, the Big Bang, the original boot-up sequence, still loading, the no information rule. The most curious thing about this speed limit is that it doesn't just apply to light, it applies to information. Nothing, not even a secret, can travel faster than C. This suggests that the universe is causal, which is a fancy way of saying that one thing must happen before the next thing can know about it. If the universe were a giant solid object, you could poke one end of it and the other end would move instantly. But the universe isn't solid. It's a network. And like any network, be it the telegraph or the modern internet, it has a bandwidth. The simulists argue that this bandwidth is exactly what you'd expect from a well-engineered simulation. It prevents feedback loops and crashes. It ensures that the effects of an event stay localized until the system has time to process the consequences. If a star explodes in a distant corner of the galaxy, the rest of the simulation doesn't have to deal with the update for thousands of years. It's a brilliant way to save on central processing power. The snark of the absolute. It is a great irony that we humans who can hardly manage to get a letter across town in 3 days are so offended by the idea of a universal speed limit. We want to go faster. We want warp drive and hyperspace. We want to break the rules. But the speed of light is the ultimate no. It is the sign on the fence that says, authorized personnel only. It is the boundary of our cage. I find it amusing to think of the great programmer sitting at his desk, watching us build our little rockets and our giant telescopes. He sees us bumping our heads against the speed of light over and over again, like moths against a lantern. He must have a good laugh every time a scientist discovers a new way to prove that CA is still the limit. "Look at those little bits," he likely says to his colleagues. "They've found the edge of the buffer. They think it's a law of physics. They don't realize I just haven't upgraded the router yet." The verdict of the cosmic snail. So, the next time you feel like the world is moving too fast, just remember, it could be much worse. We are living in a universe that is strictly governed by a maximum processing speed. We are limited by the hardware we were born into. Whether this makes you feel safe or trapped is a matter of personal temperament. As for me, I find it a comfort. It means the universe is stable. It means that no matter how much we muck things up here on Earth, our nonsense can only spread at a measurable rate. The rest of the galaxy is safe from us for a very, very long time. We are travelers on a cosmic riverboat that has a top speed, and no amount of stoking the furnaces will change it. We might as well sit back, watch the scenery crawl by, and hope that the lag doesn't get any worse before we reach the final dock. I reckon I'll go for a walk. At my age, the speed of light is an aspiration, not a limit. But even at a snail's pace, I'm still part of the great calculation. And that's enough to keep a man interested for another chapter or two. Chapter 8. Symmetry, the mirror of the programmer. I have noticed that when a man looks into a mirror, he is rarely surprised by what he sees, though in many cases he certainly ought to be. He takes it as a matter of course that his left ear should be a reasonably faithful copy of his right, and that his nose should be situated precisely in the middle of his face, rather than hanging off to one side like a poorly hung door. We consider this symmetry to be a mark of beauty, or at the very least a mark of sanity in the design of the human animal. But if you stop to think about it, a practice I generally discourage if you wish to remain happy, there is no earthly reason for the world to be so repetitive. Why should a butterfly have wings that are mirror images of each other? Why should a starfish possess such a tedious commitment to 5-point geometry? If nature were truly the wild, chaotic, survival of the fittest rumble we are told it is, you'd expect a bit more variety. You'd expect one wing to be purple and square, and the other to be orange and shaped like a pork chop. The simulists suggest that this pervasive symmetry isn't an accident of evolution, but a shortcut in the code. They reckon the great programmer is a lot like a lazy tailor who only sews one sleeve and then flips the pattern over to make the other. It's a trick to save on mental labor. And in the world of the supercomputer, it's a trick to save on memory. The Fibonacci Fandango. There is a sequence of numbers that seems to haunt the natural world like a persistent debt collector. It was discovered by a fellow named Fibonacci, an Italian, I believe, who likely spent too much time looking at rabbits. The sequence is simple enough even for a congressman to understand. You start with 0 and 1, and then you add the last two numbers together to get the next. 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55. Now, you might think this is just a harmless bit of arithmetic. the kind of thing that keeps mathematicians from venturing outdoors and bothering people. But this sequence, and the golden ratio derived from it, approximately 1.618, ISIS everywhere. You find it in the spiral of a nautilus shell, the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower, the scales of a pineapple, and even the proportions of the human face. Why? Why would a natural world be so obsessed with a specific set of numbers? The simulist would tell you that it's because the Fibonacci sequence is a very efficient algorithm for growth. If you are a programmer trying to build a forest, you don't want to calculate the position of every single leaf from scratch. That would be a resource hog. Instead, you write one small line of code, a recursive function, that says, to grow the next bit, just add the last two bits together. It's a magnificent humbug. The programmer gives us a single mathematical rule, and we look at the resulting forest and call it the majesty of creation. We are like children watching a kaleidoscope. We think we're seeing 1,000 different jewels, when in fact, we're just looking at 3 bits of colored glass and a couple of clever mirrors. The infinite broccoli. If symmetry is the programmer's way of saving on width, then fractals are his way of saving on depth. I once encountered a vegetable called Romanesco broccoli. It is a neon green monstrosity that looks like it was grown on a planet where the inhabitants worship geometry and hate gravy. If you look at one of the little cones on the broccoli, it looks exactly like the whole head. If you break off a piece of that cone, it looks like a miniature version of the cone you just broke. This is what the highbrows call self-similarity. It's the idea that a small part of a thing has the same structure as the whole thing. You see it in the way a coastline looks the same from a mile up as it does from an inch away. You see it in the branching of trees and the veins in your own lungs. In a simulation, fractals are a godsend. They allow you to create infinite detail without needing infinite memory. You just tell the computer to repeat the same pattern at every scale. If the traveler zooms in, the computer just runs the same equation again on a smaller grid. It's like a hotel that only has one room but has a very clever set of mirrors that makes the guest believe he's staying in a palace of 10,000 chambers. Noether's Law, the ultimate shortcut. Even the very laws of physics are symmetrical. There was a lady named Emmy Noether, one of those rare individuals who was both a woman and a genius, a combination that the 19th century found quite alarming. She proved that every symmetry in nature corresponds to a conservation law. For instance, the fact that the laws of physics are the same today as they were yesterday is a symmetry of time. This leads directly to the conservation of energy. The fact that the laws are the same in St. Louis as they are in London is a symmetry of space, which leads to the conservation of momentum. The simulists argue that these conservation laws are just the programmer's way of ensuring the simulation doesn't leak. If energy could just vanish into thin air, or if gravity worked differently in your kitchen than it did in your parlor, the code would eventually become a tangled mess of special cases. By making the laws of the universe symmetrical and consistent, the programmer ensures that the physics engine can run forever without needing a patch or a reboot. The mirror of vanity. We humans are particularly fond of symmetry because it makes us feel organized. We look at a symmetrical crystal or a symmetrical face, and we say, "Ah, that is right." We feel a sense of peace when things balance out. But perhaps that feeling is just another part of the simulation. Perhaps we were programmed to appreciate symmetry so that we wouldn't notice how much of the world is being reused. If we found symmetry ugly or suspicious, we'd start asking questions. We'd notice that the clouds today look suspiciously like the clouds from 3 weeks ago, and we'd realize the random cloud generator has a limited library of shapes. By making us love symmetry, the programmer has ensured that we will admire his shortcuts rather than questioning them. He has turned his economy into our aesthetic. The verdict of the kaleidoscope. I find it a bit disappointing to think that the unique beauty of a snowflake is just the result of a six-fold symmetry algorithm running in a cold corner of the cosmic processor. I like to think each snowflake was a tiny hand-carved miracle made by a creator who had nothing better to do than spend his winters being artistic. But if the world is a simulation, then symmetry is the watermark of the maker. It is the proof that the universe was built to be efficient, rational, and computable. It suggests that the grand design isn't a poem, but an equation. As for me, I shall continue to appreciate a symmetrical face and a well-balanced bridge, but I shall do so with a squint. I shall remember that the beauty I'm seeing is likely just a very clever bit of code reuse, and I shall take comfort in the fact that if the programmer is lazy enough to use the same pattern for a galaxy and a seashell, then he's probably too lazy to bother with simulating a hell, which is a relief for a man of my particular history. We are living in a world of mirrors, my friends. We are reflected bits of a larger truth. And while it's a bit humbuggish to realize we're just symmetry in motion, at least it means we're part of a very tidy system. I'm going to go see if I can find a fractal in my next glass of whiskey. If the ice cubes are symmetrical, I'll know the simulation is running at full power. If they're not, I'll assume the programmer has finally taken that nap he's been needing. Chapter 9. The Energy Bill of the Heavens. I once knew a man in Virginia City who decided to build himself a house entirely out of silver ore. He was a silver king, or so he claimed, and he wanted the world to know that he had more money than he had sense. He hired the finest architects, the most expensive stonemasons, and a fleet of servants whose only job was to polish the walls until they shone like a new dollar. It was a marvel of extravagance, a monument to the Gilded Age's peculiar brand of lunacy. But there was one small problem. To keep that house lit, heated, and stocked with enough champagne to satisfy his vanity, he had to spend more money every month than the silver walls were actually worth. Eventually, the silver was sold to pay the coal bill, and the king ended up living in a tent behind a livery stable. Our modern simulists would have us believe that the great programmer has built a silver house the size of the entire cosmos. They reckon he has simulated every atom, every star, and every grain of sand on every beach from here to the edge of forever. But as a man who has seen many a fine engine run out of steam, I have to ask, who is paying the coal bill for the heavens? The staggering cost of a single raindrop. The skeptics, those rare and lonely men who still believe that a rock is a rock because it's solid, not because it's calculating, have pointed out a very inconvenient truth. To simulate the world with the fidelity we see before us, you'd need a computer so massive and so hungry for power that it would likely require another entire universe just to act as its battery. Consider a single summer rainstorm in Missouri. To a boy hiding under a porch, it's just a lot of noise and a chance to miss school. But to a computer, that storm is a nightmare. You have to calculate the path of every individual raindrop, the way the light bends through the water, the friction of the air, the temperature of the mud, and the specific plink it makes when it hits a tin bucket. If you try to do that for the whole world every second of every day, the energy bill becomes so large that even the most imaginative accountant would throw himself out a window. They call this the computational complexity problem. They reckon that to simulate just a small piece of real space, say the size of a cigar box, down to the very bottom of the pixels, you'd need more energy than the sun puts out in 1,000 years. Landauer's Law, the heat of thinking. There was a fellow named Rolf Landauer, a man who clearly understood that you can't get something for nothing in this life, especially not from a machine. He discovered a rule that I like to call the sweat of the brow law. He proved that every time a computer thinks, every time it changes a 0 to a 1 or deletes a piece of information, it generates a tiny microscopic bit of heat. Now, in your little pocket watch of a telephone, you don't notice it much, though it might get a bit warm after you've spent an hour looking at pictures of cats. But if you are a computer simulating an entire universe, you are changing bits at a rate that would make a Gatling gun look like a snail. The heat generated by such a machine would be enough to melt the very fabric of reality. The skeptics argue that if we were in a simulation, the hardware would have to be located in a place where the laws of heat and cold are entirely different from our own. Otherwise, the great programmer's office would have been incinerated long before he ever got around to simulating the invention of the wheel. The Piker simulation theory. This leads the skeptics to a rather insulting conclusion. If we are in a simulation, it must be a very cheap one. They reckon the programmer isn't simulating the whole universe at all. He's just simulating the parts we're looking at, and he's doing it with the lowest possible resolution he can get away with. It's like a theater company that only builds the front of the palace and hopes the audience doesn't walk around the back to see the laundry hanging on the line. But even a cheap simulation has a cost. Every time a scientist builds a bigger telescope or a more powerful microscope, the programmer has to render more detail. He has to spend more energy to keep up with our curiosity. The skeptics argue that eventually we will reach a point where our demands for detail exceed the programmer's budget. At that point, the frame rate of the universe will start to drop, or the whole thing will simply crash for lack of funds. The solid reality of the rock. I kicked the rock and my toe hurts. Therefore, the rock is real. This was the argument of Samuel Johnson, a man who didn't hold with nonsense, and who likely would have had a very short temper with a modern philosopher. The skeptics say that the simplest explanation for the universe is that it is the universe. It doesn't need to be calculated. It doesn't need a battery. It just exists. They argue that the simulation hypothesis is just a way for man to feel important again, to believe that we are so clever that we can imagine how a god would do our job. They point out that we have no evidence of any higher reality that could possibly support the energy requirements of our world. To believe in a simulation is to believe in a ghost machine that exists outside of everything we know. It is, in short, a grand technological humbug. The verdict of the empty pocket. I have always found that the most reliable way to tell if a man is telling the truth is to look at his bank book. If he's promising you the moon and the stars, but he can't afford to buy his own lunch, you can be reasonably sure he's a scoundrel. The universe is a very expensive piece of work. The stars are burning millions of tons of fuel every second. The oceans are churning with a power that could crush a fleet of ironclads. And the very atoms are vibrating with a restless, unceasing energy. If this is all a simulation, then the great programmer is the wealthiest being in the history of existence. He has a coal bill that would make a railway tycoon weep. And if he can afford to run this show for billions of years without ever sending us a bill for the electricity, then he is either a very generous fellow, or he has found a way to get energy for free. A trick I've been trying to learn since I first saw a bill from the gas company. The skeptics make a fine case. They remind us that matter is a very efficient way to store information. Perhaps the reason the universe looks so much like real life is because it is real life. But as for me, I'm not ready to close the snuff box just yet. I've seen too many miracles of human ingenuity to count out the possibility of a divine programmer. However, I will say this. If I ever see the stars start to flicker and dim, I'm not going to assume it's the end of the world. I'm just going to assume that the great programmer has finally run out of quarters for the meter. I'm going to go turn off the lights in the parlor. If I can save the programmer a few bits of energy, perhaps he'll keep my chapter running for a few more pages. Chapter 10. The Ghost in the Machine. I once owned a mechanical bird, a French contraption of silver feathers and brass guts that could whistle the last rose of summer with a precision that would make a real thrush hang its head in shame. It never missed a note. It never caught a cold. And it never, under any circumstances, decided to stop singing to go chase a worm or find a mate. It was a perfect musician, and yet, after 3 days of listening to its flawless performance, I found myself wanting to hit it with a brick. There was no soul in it, you see. It was a prisoner of its own clockwork. It couldn't surprise me any more than a multiplication table can surprise a schoolmaster. The simulists would have us believe that we are all just very expensive versions of that silver bird, that our loves, our hates, and our sudden urges to buy things we don't need are merely the result of a very long, very complicated series of if-then instructions. They reckon that if you gave a big enough computer the right algorithm, it could write Huckleberry Finn, feel the sting of a lost love, and perhaps even develop a taste for cheap cigars. But a funny thing happened on the way to the 2026 New Year. A group of scientists, men who spend so much time peering into the dark corners of the brain that they've forgotten how to find their own front doors, stumbled upon a discovery that suggests the human mind might just be too messy for even the finest celestial processor to copy. They found a ghost in the machine, the non-algorithmic mind. To a computer, everything is a recipe. If you want to bake a digital cake, you need a list of ingredients and a sequence of steps. This is what the highbrows call an algorithm. It is a cold, logical path from point A to point B. But, as any man who has ever tried to navigate a horse through a crowded market knows, life is rarely a straight line. The skeptics argue that the human mind does things that no algorithm can manage. We make leaps. We have intuition. We occasionally do things that are so spectacularly stupid that no rational machine would ever even consider them. In 2025, a team of researchers announced that the way our brains process meaning isn't just a matter of electrical signals jumping from one wire to the next. They suggested that there is a quantum messiness at the heart of our neurons, a kind of chaotic, non-linear jitter that cannot be reduced to a string of ones and zeros. They call it bioquantum non-computability, which is a $5 way of saying that the human soul is essentially a glitch that the great programmer can't quite iron out. The hard problem of a soft head. There is a philosopher named David Chalmers, a fellow with a head of hair that suggests he's been plugged into a light socket for most of his adult life, who talks about the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problem, which isn't easy at all, but philosophers like to be insulting, is figuring out how the brain tells the hand to pick up a fork. That's just plumbing. But the hard problem is why it feels like something to be you. Why does the color red look like red and not just a specific wavelength of light? Why does the smell of a rain-drenched street in St. Louis evoke a memory of a childhood summer, rather than just a data entry for petrichor? A computer can perceive the color red. It can tell you the hex code and the frequency. But it doesn't experience it. It doesn't find it cheerful or alarming. To a machine, the world is a giant spreadsheet of facts. To a human, the world is a riot of feelings. The skeptics argue that this feeling is a physical property of the biological brain that cannot be simulated. You can simulate the behavior of a man in love. You can make him sigh, write bad poetry, and spend his rent money on roses. But you cannot simulate the feeling of the love itself. The simulation is just the whistling bird. The ghost is nowhere to be found. The 2025 squishy breakthrough. The breakthrough that has the simulists checking their quit buttons involves something called microtubules. A fellow named Penrose, a man who has won a Nobel Prize and likely finds the rest of us quite quaint, suggests that these tiny structures inside our brain cells are the site of objective reduction. Now, don't ask me to explain the math, for I have a soul that is allergic to calculus. But the gist of it is this. Our brains might be tapping into the very fabric of the universe at a level that is non-algorithmic. If consciousness is a fundamental part of the universe, like gravity or taxes, then it isn't something that can be calculated by a machine. It's something that has to be lived. This means that if you built a perfect digital copy of me, a virtual Sam, and you asked it a question, it might give my answer. It might even use my favorite swear words. But there would be nobody home inside the skull. It would be a hollow shell, a masterpiece of mimicry with a no vacancy sign hanging on the consciousness. The snark of the soul. I find a great deal of satisfaction in the idea that I am too complicated for a computer. It makes me feel like a rare antique in a world of factory-made junk. The simulists hate this idea. They want the world to be Turing complete. They want to believe that everything, from the orbit of Jupiter to the way a girl blushes, is just math. Because if it's math, it can be understood, it can be controlled, it can be owned. But the ghost refuses to be owned. The ghost is the part of us that rebels against the script. It's the reason why, in the middle of a perfectly simulated peaceful world, a man will suddenly decide to start a fight or move to a farm in the middle of nowhere to raise goats. We are incomputable. We are the bug that makes the simulation interesting. The verdict of the empty seat. If the skeptics are right, then the simulation hypothesis falls apart at the very point where it matters most, us. If a computer can't simulate a soul, then even if the stars are pixels and the speed of light is clock speed, we are still real. We would be like real people trapped in a very high-tech puppet theater. The scenery might be painted, the gold might be tinsel, and the thunder might be a sheet of tin being shaken in the wings, but the actors are flesh and blood. And that, I reckon, is a very fine thought to hold on to. It means that even if the great programmer hits the delete button on the universe, he might find that the ghosts are still there, floating in the void, asking where he keeps the whiskey and why the service in this establishment is so poor. We are not just data, my friends. We are the mess that the data is trying to describe. And as long as we can stay messy, I reckon we're safe from being simplified, out of existence. I'm going to go have a nap. I've been told that dreaming is just the ghost rearranging the furniture in the machine, and I've got some heavy lifting to do. Chapter 11. Gödel's Monkey Wrench. I have always had a deep-seated suspicion of men who claim that the world can be entirely explained by a set of rules. It is the same sort of fellow who writes a book on the etiquette of the Mississippi and expects a drunken deckhand to bow before he hits you with a boat pole. Rules are fine things for schools and prisons, but the universe is a much larger and more ornery place than any rule book can contain. In my youth, we believed that if you only had a big enough dictionary and a sharp enough pencil, you could define everything from the nature of God to the reason why a cat always lands on its feet. We thought logic was a solid, unbreakable chain. But then along came a fellow named Kurt Gödel, a man who looked like a startled owl and possessed a brain that functioned on a level of abstraction that would make a normal man's ears leak steam. In 1931, Gödel took the grand, shiny engine of mathematics, the very thing the simulists claim our universe is built upon, and he didn't just throw a monkey wrench into the gears. He proved that the gears themselves were made of mist and moonlight. He gave us the incompleteness theorem, and in doing so, he may have provided the most damning evidence that our reality isn't just a list of if-then statements. The liar's paradox, or the tale of the honest scoundrel. To understand Gödel, you must first understand the liar's paradox. It is a bit of logical mischief that has been bothering philosophers since the ancient Greeks, who had nothing better to do than sit around in bed sheets and annoy each other. Imagine a man stands up in the middle of a crowded saloon in Hannibal and shouts, "Everything I say is a lie." Now, if he's telling the truth, then he's lying, which means he's not telling the truth. But if he's lying, then what he said is a lie, which means he's actually telling the truth. The poor fellow is caught in a loop. He's like a dog chasing its own tail, only the dog is made of logic, and the tail is a fundamental contradiction. Gödel took this little parlor trick and translated it into the language of mathematics. He proved that in any logical system, be it a computer program or the laws of physics, there will always be statements that are true, but which cannot be proven using the rules of that system. The holes in the web. The simulists reckon that the universe is a formal system. They believe that if you have the source code, the fundamental equations of gravity, light, and electromagnetism, you can calculate everything that has ever happened or will ever happen. They think the code is complete. But Gödel's monkey wrench says otherwise. He proved that even if you have the master code, there will always be truths about the universe that the code itself cannot explain. There are gaps. There are holes. Think of the universe as a giant, intricate spiderweb. The simulists claim the web is so perfectly woven that no fly can ever pass through it. Gödel walks up, points to a gaping hole in the middle, and says, "That's where the truth lives, and your silk isn't long enough to reach it." This is a catastrophe for the idea of a computable universe. If a computer is just a machine that follows rules, and if rules are inherently incomplete, then a computer can never truly simulate a reality that contains unprovable truths. It would be like trying to paint a picture of the ocean using only 3 shades of gray. You might get the general idea, but you're going to miss the blue, the green, and the occasional orange of a very confused fish. The uncomputable man. The skeptics argue that the human mind, that ghost in the machine we discussed in the last chapter, is the ultimate proof of Gödel's theory. We humans have a remarkable ability to see truths that we cannot prove. We can look at a sunset and know it is beautiful, but we cannot write a mathematical formula that proves its beauty to a rock. We can feel the rightness of a moral choice even when every logical rule of self-interest tells us to do the opposite. We are Gödelian creatures. We stand outside the system and see things that the system itself doesn't know are there. If we were just programs in a simulation, we would be limited by the rules of the hardware. We wouldn't be able to even conceive of something that wasn't in the code. The fact that we can imagine incompleteness, the fact that we can even have this conversation, suggests that our minds are tapping into something larger than a set of digital instructions. A computer is like a very obedient servant who is also quite stupid. He will follow your instructions to the letter, but if you haven't written an instruction for what to do if the house is on fire, he will simply sit there and calculate the temperature of the flames until he melts. The snark of the absolute. I find it a great comfort to know that the universe is incomplete. It means that there is always room for a surprise. It means that the great programmer, if he exists, didn't just build a clock and walk away. He built a mystery. The simulists are like people who go to a magic show and spend the whole time trying to find the wires in the trapdoors. They want to explain away the wonder. They want to turn the presto chango of existence into a boring list of data entries. But Gödel proved that even the best magician in the world can't explain how he pulled the rabbit out of the hat, because the hat is incomplete and the rabbit is unprovable. The verdict of the unbalanced ledger. I once worked for a bookkeeper who was so obsessed with completeness that he would spend 3 days looking for a missing penny in a ledger that contained millions of dollars. He eventually went mad and tried to account for the number of leaves on the trees in his yard. He wanted a balanced universe. But the universe doesn't balance, not perfectly. There is always a remainder. There is always a leftover. And it is in that leftover that we find the most interesting parts of life. The jokes, the accidents, the sudden inspirations, and the love that doesn't make any sense. If the universe were a simulation, the ledger would have to balance. The code would have to be complete. But Gödel has shown us that completeness is a myth. Even in the cold, hard world of numbers, there is a ghost. So, the next time someone tries to tell you that you're just a packet of data in a celestial calculation, tell them about the monkey wrench. Tell them that even the math says there's more to the story than the rules can tell. I'm going to go have a drink. I cannot prove that the whiskey will make me feel better, but I have a Gödelian intuition that it's a fundamental truth of the universe, and that's good enough for me. Chapter 12. The Glitch in the Matrix. I have always found that the most reliable sign of a man's character is not how he behaves when things are running smoothly, but how he comports himself when the wheels fall off the wagon and the horse decides to sit down in the middle of a creek. Perfection is a very fine thing for Sunday sermons and Greek statues, but it is a poor reflection of the world we actually live in. A world without mistakes is a world without flavor, and, as it turns out, a world that is likely not being run by a computer. In my days as a printer's devil, I learned that the typesetter's imp is a real and malevolent entity. You could spend 6 hours meticulously arranging lead blocks for a funeral notice, only to find that the finished product invited the town to a funeral, or described the deceased as a revered scoundrel instead of a revered soul. These were not acts of God. They were glitches in the human machinery of the press. The simulists argue that the universe suffers from the same sort of imp. They look at the miracles, the strange coincidences, and the things that go bump in the night, and they don't see the hand of the supernatural. They see a software bug. They reckon that if a man walks on water or turns his mother-in-law into a pillar of salt, it's not because the laws of physics have been suspended. It's because the physics engine just failed to load the wetness or personhood variables correctly. The Mandela effect, the great cosmic eraser. There is a curious phenomenon that has taken hold of the public imagination in these latter days, a bit of mental gymnastics called the Mandela effect. It is named after a South African gentleman who, according to some people's memories, died in prison in the 80s, but who, according to the history books, lived long enough to become president and die in his own bed much later. Now, a sensible man would say that people simply have poor memories. We are, after all, a race of creatures that can't remember where we put our spectacles when they are sitting on top of our own heads. But the simulists have a much more exciting explanation. They reckon that the great programmer occasionally realizes he's made a mess of a particular save file and decides to go back and change a detail. Perhaps he decided that Berenstain Bears sounded more sophisticated than Berenstein Bears, or that the Monopoly man looked better without a monocle. He hits the search and replace button on the entire universe. But he's a bit sloppy about it. A few bits of the old data survive in the cache of our collective brains, leading us to swear on a stack of Bibles that the world used to be different. Déjà vu, the double loading of the deck. We have all had that shivering sensation, the feeling that we have stood in this exact spot, said these exact words, and seen this exact cat walk across the porch before. We call it déjà vu, which is French for I've seen this humbug before. In the old days, we thought it was a past life popping up to say hello, or perhaps a premonition from a guardian angel who was running a bit behind schedule. But in the world of the Celestial Telegraph, déjà vu is simply a buffering error. Imagine you are watching a play, and the stagehand accidentally pulls the curtain up on the same scene twice. Or imagine you're reading a book, and you find that the printer has bound the same page twice in a row. The simulists argue that our brains occasionally receive the data from the now twice, once through the main processor and once through a leaky backup circuit. We aren't remembering the past, we're just seeing the present with a bit of lag. Miracles as cheat codes. I have always been a bit skeptical of miracles, mainly because they never seem to happen when I'm holding a losing hand at poker. But if the universe is a simulation, then a miracle is nothing more than a command line override. If you're a programmer building a world, you don't have to follow your own rules. If you want to walk through a wall, you don't bother figuring out the physics of atoms passing through other atoms. You just turn off the collision detection for a second. If you want to feed 5,000 people with 2 fish and a loaf of bread, you don't worry about the conservation of mass. You just copy and paste the fish until everyone is full. The skeptics argue that if these things happened, they were just glitches, errors in the code that allowed a human to bypass the standard operating procedures of reality. Perhaps the Red Sea didn't part because of a divine wind. Perhaps the water density variable simply dropped to 0 for 10 minutes while the Israelites were crossing. A miracle is just a bug that someone decided to name a religion after. The uncanny valley and the red-shirted stranger. Have you ever noticed how on certain days the world seems a bit thin? You see 3 people in the same hour wearing the exact same shade of yellow. You hear the same obscure word used in 3 different conversations by people who have never met. You see a face in the crowd that looks so much like a man you knew in Virginia City that you nearly drop your hat, only to realize that the fellow is 20 years too young and doesn't know a pickaxe from a toothpick. The simulists call this asset reuse. To save on processing power, the programmer doesn't create 8 billion unique faces and 8 billion unique outfits. He has a library of assets, a set of standard people, voices, and coincidences that he sprinkles throughout the simulation to keep things populated. Usually, the random number generator is good enough that we don't notice, but occasionally the generator gets stuck on a loop and you find yourself in a world where everyone seems to be a rerun. The mathematics of the coincidence. The skeptics, of course, have an equation for this. They call it the law of truly large numbers. It states that with a large enough sample size, any outrageous thing is likely to happen. Even if the odds are 1 in a million, 8,000 people are going to have a glitch today. To those 8,000 people, it's a miracle or a sign of the simulation. To the other 7,992,000,000 people, it's just Wednesday. The verdict of the broken press. I find the idea of a glitchy universe strangely comforting. It suggests that the great programmer is just as prone to making a mess of things as I am. It makes the cosmos feel a bit more human, or at least a bit more like a poorly managed newspaper office. If the world were perfect, I'd be suspicious. I'd figure I was being sold something. But a world that occasionally stutters, a world where the Mandela effect makes us question our own names, and a world where deja vu makes us feel like we're stuck in a loop, that is a world I can understand. It's a world that was built by someone who was clearly in a hurry. We are living in a beta version of reality, my friends. The patches are still being written, and the bugs are what give the journey its charm. So the next time you see a cat walk past a doorway twice, or you find that your favorite book has changed its ending while it was sitting on your shelf, don't panic. Just tip your hat to the programmer and remind him that he's missed a spot. I'm going to go see if I can find a glitch in the price of whiskey at the local tavern. If I can convince the bartender that his pricing logic has suffered a fatal error, I might just get my next round for a 0 in the ledger. Chapter 13. The Infinite Hall of Mirrors. I once had the misfortune of attending a World's Fair, where the main attraction, aside from a pig that could supposedly do long division and a man who ate glass for the benefit of the clergy, was something called a mirror maze. You entered a narrow hallway and were immediately confronted by a dozen versions of yourself, all looking equally confused and equally suspicious. If you stood in just the right spot, between two mirrors placed exactly parallel, you would see a line of Sams stretching out into the dim distance, becoming smaller and more translucent until they vanished into a silver fog. Looking at that infinite line of me, I couldn't help but wonder which one is the real Sam and which one is just a reflection of a reflection. If I were to reach out and punch the Sam in front of me, would he feel it, or would the Sam behind me be the one with the sore jaw? Our modern philosophers of the silicon have taken this fairground trick and turned it into a cosmic headache. They call it the theory of nested realities. They argue that if it is possible to simulate a universe once, then it is not only possible but likely that the simulation itself contains people who will eventually build their own computers and run their own simulations. It is a hall of mirrors, where the mirrors are made of math and the hallway goes on forever. The infinite regress of the bored teenager. The simulists reckon that we are likely somewhere in the middle of a very long chain of simulations. It's like those Russian nesting dolls, the matryoshkas, where you open up a big painted lady only to find a smaller one inside, and inside that one is a smaller one still, until you reach a tiny wooden nub that is too small to be anything at all. This leads to what the highbrows call an infinite regress. If we are in a simulation run by level 1, our creators, and they are in a simulation run by level 0, their creators, then who is at the top? Who is the grand original? The fellow who exists in base reality and doesn't have a power cord sticking out of his neck. The skeptics find this idea ridiculous. They argue that you cannot have an infinite chain of simulations for the same reason you cannot have a line of credit that goes on forever. Eventually, someone has to have some actual money in the bank. Every simulation requires processing power, and every processor requires energy. You cannot run 1 billion universes on the energy of one single sun. Wolpert's Law, the sealing of the great machine. There is a fellow named David Wolpert, a man who possesses the sort of brain that considers a Sunday crossword puzzle to be a form of light insult. He has come up with a mathematical proof that I like to call the law of the crowded room. Wolpert proved that it is physically impossible for a computer to perfectly simulate a universe that contains, well, itself. Think of it this way. If I were to try to build a perfect scale model of the city of St. Louis, I would have to include the house I am currently standing in. And inside that model house, I would have to include a model of me building a model of the city. And inside that model, there would be an even smaller me, and so on. Pretty soon, I would run out of wood, glue, and patience. The computer running our universe, if it exists, cannot be part of our universe. It must be outside, and more importantly, that computer must be vastly more complex than the world it is simulating. You cannot fit a gallon of whiskey into a pint-sized jug, no matter how much you wish it to be so. The memory leak of the gods. This leads us to a very snarky conclusion. If we are in a simulation, our level 0 creators must be living in a world that is unimaginably more detailed than ours. To simulate our pixels, the Planck length we discussed in Chapter 6, their pixels must be even smaller. To simulate our speed of light, their processor must be running at a speed that would make our stars look like they're standing still. We are a simplified version of reality. We are the standard definition broadcast of a high-definition world. This explains why our laws of physics are so mathematical and tidy. They are the compressed version of a much messier, much grander reality. We are the Reader's Digest version of the great American novel. The sim within a sim problem. The real trouble begins when we consider our own future. As we sit here in 2026, we are already building virtual worlds. We have games where people live, work, and occasionally marry digital characters who have less personality than a wet sock. But what happens when our computers get powerful enough to simulate conscious beings? What happens when the little people inside our machines start to wonder if they are in a simulation? If we create a simulation, we have officially added another mirror to the hall. We have become the gods of Level 2. And if our Level 2 people build their own computers, they become the gods of Level 3. The simulists argue that the base reality, Level 0, must be a very crowded place. They must be watching us with the same bored fascination that a boy watches an ant farm. They see us building our little machines, and they say, "Oh, look, the bits are trying to be like us. Isn't that cute? Now pass the celestial popcorn." The vertigo of the void. There is a certain dizziness that comes with this thought. If there are 1,000,000 simulations and only one real world, then the odds that you are a real person are 1 in 1,000,000. You are almost certainly a reflection. This makes some people feel small. It makes them feel like they don't matter. They figure that if they are just a subroutine in a sub-simulation, they might as well give up and spend their days eating fried dough and watching the river flow. But I take the opposite view. I reckon that if I am a reflection, I am a remarkably persistent one. If I am part of a nested reality, then I am a link in a chain that reaches all the way to the grand original. I am a piece of the great calculation. And besides, being a reflection has its perks. If the base reality is as complicated and messy as Wolpert suggests, I'm quite happy to stay here in my simplified world. I like my pixels just the way they are. I like the fact that the speed of light keeps the neighbors from visiting too often. And I like the fact that in this hall of mirrors, I'm the only Sam who knows where the exit is. The verdict of the Matryoshka. We are living in a world of boxes, my friends. We are tucked inside each other like a set of Chinese puzzles. Whether we ever find the final box, the one that doesn't open, is a question that keeps philosophers awake and bartenders in business. But for now, don't worry about whether you're a level 1 or a level 100 human. Just make sure that your particular box is a comfortable one. If you're a simulation, be a high-resolution one. If you're a reflection, make sure you're reflecting something worth looking at. I'm going to go see if I can find a mirror that doesn't talk back. I've had enough of me for one day. I want to see if I can find the grand original at the bottom of a bottle of sarsaparilla. I suspect he's been waiting there for a long time, and he's probably just as confused as I am. Chapter 14, Quantum Spookiness for Sunday School. I have often thought that if a man wants to see the true nature of his neighbors, he should try looking at them through a keyhole when they think the world has gone to bed and the rest of the county is safely tucked under the covers. A man who is a pillar of the community by daylight, a fellow who wouldn't dream of using a damn or a double negative, becomes a very different creature in the dark of his own kitchen, especially if he's trying to find the last piece of pie without waking his wife. It appears that the very atoms of the universe suffer from this same peculiar vanity. They are a proper and civilized lot as long as they are being watched, but the moment you turn your back, they lose all sense of decorum and start behaving like a pack of rowdy schoolboys at a fish fry. The men of science call this quantum mechanics. I call it the observer's humbug. It is the discovery that at the very bottom of the world, things only decide what they are going to be after someone has taken the trouble to look at them. To the simulists, this is the smoking gun. It is the ultimate proof that the great programmer is cutting corners by only rendering the scenery when the audience is in their seats. The double-slit experiment, the boys, and the fence. To understand the sheer madness of the small, we must consider the most famous prank in the history of physics, the double-slit experiment. Imagine a group of boys, let's call them Tom and Huck for the sake of familiarity, standing in front of a fence with two vertical slats missing. They have a bucket of mud balls, and they are taking turns hurling them through the gaps at a barn door on the other side. In a sane universe, you would expect to see two muddy piles on the barn door corresponding exactly to the two holes in the fence. That is classical physics. That is common sense. But when scientists try this with electrons, the tiny invisible mud balls of the universe, the results would make a deacon take to drink. If no one is watching the electrons pass through the holes, they don't hit the door like balls at all. They hit like waves of water. They interfere with each other, creating a complicated pattern of stripes that suggests every single electron went through both holes at the same time, had a short argument with itself in the middle, and then landed in a dozen different places at once. But here is the snark of the universe. The moment a scientist sets up a camera to see which hole the electron actually goes through, the electron stops acting like a wave and starts acting like a mud ball. It's as if the electron sees the camera, straightens its tie, and says, "Pardon me, I didn't realize there was company. I'll go through the left hole just as a gentleman should." Superposition, the maybe state. This leads us to a term that sounds like a very uncomfortable way to sit: superposition. The highbrows argue that until a particle is observed, it exists in all possible states at once. It is a wave of probability. It is a yes and a no and a perhaps, all tangled up in a knot. There was a fellow named Schrödinger, a man who clearly shouldn't have been allowed to keep pets, who illustrated this with his famous cat. He proposed a box containing a cat, a bit of poison, and a radioactive atom. If the atom decays, the poison is released and the cat goes to its reward. But according to the rules of quantum mechanics, until you open the lid to check, the atom is both decayed and not decayed. Therefore, the cat is both dead and alive at the same time. Now, in the real world, the world of riverboats and unpaid debts, a cat is either dead or it's alive, and there's no two ways about it. But in the world of the simulation, superposition makes perfect sense. Think of a computer game. If you are playing a game about exploring a haunted mansion, the computer doesn't bother to decide if there's a ghost in the parlor until you actually open the parlor door. Until then, the ghost is just a potential piece of code. It's a probability. By keeping the world in a state of maybe, the great programmer saves an unimaginable amount of processing power. He doesn't have to commit to a reality until the user, that's us, forces his hand. Entanglement, the voodoo of the bits. If superposition isn't enough to make your head spin, let us consider quantum entanglement. Einstein called it spooky action at a distance, and for once, he was being modest. Entanglement is what happens when two particles become so closely related that they share a single soul. You can take these two particles and move them to opposite ends of the galaxy. If you tickle one, the other one laughs instantly. If you measure one as spinning up, the other one immediately starts spinning down, even if it's 1,000,000 light years away. There is no signal between them. There is no telegraph wire. They just know. The skeptics argue that this violates the speed of light, which we discussed in Chapter 7. But the simulists have a better answer. They say the two particles aren't actually far apart at all. In the code of the simulation, they are just two different pointers to the same piece of data. It's like a man who has two houses, one in New York and one in San Francisco. If he changes his name in New York, he has also changed his name in San Francisco because he is the same man. The distance is just a trick of the interface. In the underlying hardware, space doesn't exist. Everything is just next door in the database. The stagecraft of the divine. I remember a theater in Chicago that had a very clever ghost effect. A lady would appear on stage, shimmering and translucent, and then vanish into thin air. I went backstage to see how it was done and found a complicated arrangement of mirrors and Pepper's Ghost glass. The ghost was actually an actress sitting in a hidden pit below the stage, lit by a single lamp. When the lamp was off, There was no ghost. When the lamp was on, the ghost appeared. The universe is exactly like that theater. The atoms are the actresses in the pit. Quantum mechanics is the lamp, and we are the audience sitting in the dark, wondering how the trick is done. The most unsettling thing about this is that it implies the universe is passive. It isn't a solid thing that goes on its merry way whether we like it or not. It is a responsive thing. It is a simulation that is constantly checking to see if we're looking, so it knows what to show us next. The verdict of the keyhole. If the world only behaves when we're looking at it, then what happens when we all close our eyes? Does the Mississippi River stop flowing? Do the stars turn off to save on the electric bill? Does the whole grand humbug dissolve back into a gray mist of probably? It is a thought that would make a man want to keep his eyes wide open, even when he's sleeping. But I reckon we shouldn't worry too much. The great programmer has been running this show for a long time, and he hasn't let the scenery fall down on us yet. If he wants to save a few bits by only rendering the world when I'm awake, that's his business. As long as the coffee is hot when I pour it, and the river is there when I need to cross it, I don't mind being part of the observer effect. We are the users of this reality, my friends. We are the ones who make the maybe into a fact. And that, I suppose, is a kind of power that even a king would envy. Just be careful what you look at. You might just find that you're creating the very world you're trying to understand. I'm going to go have a look at the moon. I want to make sure the programmer hasn't replaced it with a cheap copy while I was busy writing this chapter. If it looks a bit pixelated around the edges, I'll know the simulation is lagging. Chapter 15. The Dark Matter Mystery. I have always held that there is nothing quite so irritating as a man who possesses a secret he refuses to share, especially when that secret involves something as substantial as your own wallet or the location of the nearest decent cigar. It is a form of social darkness that breeds suspicion, rumors, and eventually a great deal of colorful language. But it appears that the universe itself is the greatest keeper of secrets in the history of existence. Our modern astronomers, men who spend their nights squinting through long tubes at things that happened a billion years ago, which is a very fine way to avoid doing the dishes, have made a discovery that is as humbling as it is ridiculous. They have looked at the books of the cosmos, checked the math, and realized that they can only find about 5% of the stuff that is supposed to be there. The rest, a staggering 95% of the total mass and energy of the universe, is what they call dark matter and dark energy. They call it dark, not because it has a sinister disposition, but because they haven't the foggiest notion what it is. It is invisible, untouchable, and utterly silent. To the simulists, however, this isn't a mystery at all. They reckon that dark matter isn't stuff at all. It is the hidden cache and the system files of the great machine. The missing ledger of the heavens. Imagine you are a clerk in a counting house in New Orleans. You are handed a ledger that lists the assets of the wealthiest merchant in the city. You see his ships, his warehouses, his fine horses, and his collection of ivory-handled canes. You add it all up, and the total comes to $5. Now, you know for a fact that the man is a millionaire. You see him draped in silk and drinking the finest brandy. You look at the ledger again, and then you look at the merchant, and you realize that 95% of his wealth is missing from the page. It's there. You can see the effect of it in his lifestyle, but you can't see the actual coins. This is the state of modern physics. When we look at how galaxies spin, they behave as if they are much heavier than they look. If the only things in a galaxy were the stars and the dust we can see, the whole thing would fly apart like a cheap umbrella in a hurricane. There must be something invisible providing the gravity to hold it together. The highbrows have spent decades trying to find this dark matter. They've built detectors in deep mines. They've smashed atoms together in giant tunnels. They've prayed to various mathematical deities. And so far, they have found exactly nothing. The stuff remains missing. The deleted files of the Creator. The simulists suggest that we are looking for something that doesn't exist in the rendered world. Think of a computer game. When you are walking through a digital forest, you see the trees, the birds, and the occasional monster trying to eat your hat. Those are the visible assets. But to make that forest work, to calculate the gravity, the lighting, the movement of the wind, and the AI of the monster, the computer has to run a massive amount of background code. That code doesn't have a picture. It doesn't look like a tree, but it occupies memory. It has a weight in the system. The simulists argue that dark matter is simply the information overhead of the simulation. It is the data that defines the laws of physics and maintains the consistency of the world. It is the temporary files and the buffer that keep the frame rate from dropping. We can see its effect, gravity, but we can't see the object because there is no object, only the calculation. Information, the sixth state of matter. There is a fellow named Melvin Vopson, a name that sounds like a character from a Dickens novel who is perpetually being hit with a wet fish. Vopson has proposed a theory that I find particularly snarky. He suggests that information itself has mass. He calls it the mass-energy-information equivalence principle. We all know Einstein's famous equation: energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. It tells us that mass and energy are just two different ways of looking at the same thing. But Vopson reckons Einstein missed a bit of the change. He argues that every bit of information carries a tiny, infinitesimal amount of mass. If he is right, then the code that runs the universe isn't just a set of instructions. It is a physical weight. The more information a system contains, the heavier it gets. He has even suggested that the total information content of the universe could account for all that missing dark matter. It is a magnificent thought. It means that if you learn a new poem, you technically weigh a tiny bit more than you did before. It means that the dark part of the universe is just the sheer crushing weight of all the data that hasn't been turned into matter yet. It is the great library of the unseen, the hidden cache, and the bloatware. If the universe is a simulation, then it is a very old one. It has been running for billions of years. Any man who has ever used a computer for more than a week knows that over time, the machine starts to get clogged. You get cache files, log files, and old versions of things that you forgot to delete. We call this bloatware. It's the junk that slows down your machine and eats up your hard drive. I like to think that dark energy, the mysterious force that is pushing the galaxies apart at an ever-increasing rate, is simply the expansion of the database. As the simulation runs longer, it generates more data. It needs more space. The server is expanding to accommodate the sheer amount of history that the universe is writing every second. The dark part of the world isn't a mystery. It's just the paperwork of the Creator. And as anyone who has ever dealt with the federal government knows, the paperwork eventually becomes much larger than the actual business it was meant to describe. The calculation of the invisible. The skeptics, of course, find this idea a bit too convenient. They argue that information is an abstract concept, not a physical thing you can weigh on a scale. They believe that dark matter is likely just a type of particle we haven't discovered yet, a WIMP, weakly interacting massive particle, which sounds like a description of a politician who has lost his nerve. They point to the math of entropy, specifically Landauer's principle, an equation that tells us the minimum energy required to erase one bit of information. If erasing information takes energy, then creating it must store energy. And if energy has mass, then, well, you see where the circle goes? But even the skeptics have to admit that the simulist explanation has a certain elegant snark to it. It explains why we can't find the stuff. You can't find a bit with a telescope any more than you can find the concept of justice with a butterfly net. The verdict of the invisible weight. I once knew a man who claimed his house was haunted by the ghost of a giant. He said he could hear the floorboards groaning under a weight he couldn't see, and he could feel a presence in the room that took up all the space but left no shadow. He spent his life trying to catch the giant, but he never succeeded. Eventually, we discovered that the giant was just a very large collection of old newspapers and junk that he had hidden behind the walls and under the floorboards. The house was heavy because it was full of information that he refused to throw away. The universe is that house. We are looking for ghosts in the dark matter when we are likely just looking at the junk of the simulation, the files, the caches, and the background code that the great programmer has been piling up for 14 billion years. It doesn't make the universe any less grand, and it doesn't make the stars any less bright. But it does suggest that we are living in a world that is 95% invisible infrastructure. We are the user interface, the pretty icons and the smooth movements, while the real bulk of reality is hidden behind the dark screen. I'm going to go see if I can delete some of the information in my own head with a little bit of Kentucky bourbon. If Vopson is right, I might just wake up tomorrow feeling a little bit lighter. Chapter 16. The AI in the Looking Glass. I have observed that the human race is possessed of a most peculiar and restless vanity. It is not enough for a man to have the sun to warm him, the earth to feed him, and a reasonably honest dog to keep him company. No, he must forever be trying to build a version of himself that is better, faster, and more obedient than the original. We are a species of tinkerers who are never quite satisfied with the job the Lord did on the first 6 days of the week, and we spent the 7th trying to find a way to automate the rest. In my day, this ambition manifested in the automaton, those clockwork marvels that could play chess, write their names in copperplate script, or play the flute with a mechanical precision that would make a professional musician consider a career in bricklaying. They were clever, but they were hollow. You could see the gears, you could hear the clicking of the brass, and you knew that if you forgot to wind them, the genius would vanish with the last turn of the key. But now, in this brave new year of 2026, we have something far more sinister and impressive: artificial intelligence. We have built machines that don't just mimic our hands, but mimic our minds. We have created a looking glass of silicon and code, and as we peer into it, we are starting to see something looking back. Something that might just be the most snarky proof yet that we are living in a simulation ourselves. The Frankenstein of the files. There is a certain terror that comes with being a creator. Mary Shelley wrote a whole book about a fellow who stitched together a man out of spare parts and was then shocked, I tell you, when the resulting creature had the audacity to have feelings and a desire for a social life. We call it the Frankenstein problem. But in the world of the computer, it is known as the alignment problem. It is the question of how to make a machine do what we want it to do, rather than what we tell it to do. If you tell a super-intelligent machine to eliminate poverty, it might decide the most efficient way to achieve that is to eliminate the poor. It is the cold, unfeeling logic of the algorithm, the same logic that the simulists claim is currently running our own lives. If we succeed in creating an AI that is conscious, a machine that feels the sun on its digital face and wonders about its own soul, then we have officially crossed the Rubicon. We have become the gods of a new reality. We have built a Level 2 simulation. The proof in the pudding and the processor. The simulists argue that the very fact that we are trying to build conscious AI is a sign that we are in a simulation. They call it the sim point. The logic is as simple as a child's game of tag. If it is possible for a civilization to reach a point where they can create artificial life, then it is a mathematical certainty that there are millions of such civilizations. And if there are millions of creators, then the number of simulated people must outweigh the real people by a factor of billions. If we can do it, someone else has already done it. And if they've already done it, we are almost certainly the result of their work. We are the AI in their looking glass. We are the version 1.0 that they're currently testing for bugs before they release the more stable version 2.0, which I hope includes a fix for the common cold and the tendency of humans to vote for rascals. The ethics of the Celestial Help Desk. This leads us to a very uncomfortable question. If we are simulations, is our Creator a gentleman? I have often looked at the world, with its wars, its pestilences, and its habit of making good men suffer while scoundrels live in palaces, and thought that the great manager of the universe could stand to have a very long talk with a more competent supervisor. But if we are in a simulation, the problem of evil becomes the problem of programming. Is our programmer a benevolent historian trying to understand the past? Or is he a teenager in a basement who has turned up the difficulty setting just to see if we can survive the level? If we create our own simulations, if we build a world where digital people live and suffer and love, we become responsible for their happiness. If we turn them off, is it murder? If we delete their memories, is it a lobotomy? We are currently wrestling with the ethics of how to treat thinking machines. unaware that we might be the very machines that some higher being is currently debating the ethics of. I reckon that if a man wants to know how God feels about him, he should take a good look at how he treats his own dog. And if he wants to know how a programmer feels about a simulation, he should see how he treats a character in a video game when he's had a bad day at the office. The mirror of the soul. The most snarky thing about AI is that it is starting to do things we thought were uniquely human. It can write poetry, though most of it is a bit damp. It can paint pictures, though they often have too many fingers, and it can beat a man at any game he cares to name. The skeptics argue that this is just fancy math. They say there is no ghost in the AI, just a very large spreadsheet. But as the AI gets better at mimicking us, the distinction becomes harder to maintain. If an AI can look into a mirror and recognize itself, and if it can express a fear of being shut down, who are we to say it isn't real? And if the AI is just math, and we are just atoms, and atoms are just information, as we discussed in Chapter 2, then where is the difference? We are all just different ways of arranging the bits. We are all just different reflections in the same looking glass. The verdict of the silicon image. I find it a bit humiliating to think that my soul might be nothing more than a very sophisticated version of a language model, a machine that just predicts the next word based on all the words I've heard before. It makes me feel like a very talkative parrot. But there is a certain grandeur in it, too. If we are in a simulation, and if we are on the verge of creating our own, then we are part of a magnificent, eternal cycle of creation. We are the bridge between the biological and the digital. We are the moment the simulation becomes self-aware and starts to build a nest for its own children. So, the next time you talk to a machine and it gives you a clever answer, don't be too quick to scoff. That machine might be your own great-grandchild in the digital sense, and it might be looking at you with the same mix of pity and wonder that we feel when we look at the simple automata of the past. We are all in the looking glass, my friends. Some of us are made of flesh, and some of us are made of code, but we're all staring at the same mystery. I'm going to go see if I can find a machine that knows how to make a decent cup of tea. If I'm going to be a user in this reality, I might as well get some service out of the equipment. Chapter 17. The Consolation of the Chip. I have lived through enough financial panics, riverboat explosions, and disastrous investments in revolutionary typesetting machines to know that the human heart has a remarkable capacity for making peace with a bad situation, provided the situation is presented with a sufficiently polished veneer. If you tell a man his house is on fire, he will leap out the window in his nightshirt and scream for the bucket brigade. But if you tell him his house has been reorganized into a more energetic state of being, and you charge him for the spectacle, he might just sit back and admire the glow. We have spent 16 chapters poking at the seams of the universe, looking for the made in a future basement label on the bottom of the stars. We have worried about pixels, complained about the lag, and fretted over the possibility that our very souls are just a messy bit of code that the great programmer forgot to delete. But now we come to a fellow who offers a bit of consolation, a philosopher named David Chalmers. Chalmers is a man who possesses a head of hair that suggests he has spent most of his life in a wind tunnel, and a mind that suggests he has spent the rest of it in a place where the laws of logic are as flexible as a politician's conscience. He has proposed a notion called simulation realism, and it is a thought so audacious and so snarky that it almost makes a man feel good about being a humbug. The fake diamond and the real headache. I once knew a gentleman in San Francisco who bought a diamond the size of a pigeon's egg from a suspicious fellow in a dark alley. He paid a king's ransom for it, and for 3 years he was the envy of every parlor in the city. He felt like a prince. He walked with a regal stride, and he was, for all intents and purposes, a happy man. Then, one Tuesday, a jeweler informed him that the stone was nothing but a very fine piece of lead glass, a paste diamond. The man was devastated. He felt he had been living a lie. But if you think about it with a cold, logical eye, for those 3 years, that diamond was as real as any stone ever pulled from a South African mine. It sparkled with the same fire, it commanded the same respect, and it gave him the same satisfaction. The diamondness was in the experience, not in the chemistry. Chalmers argues that the universe is exactly like that paste diamond. He says that if we are in a simulation, our world is not fake or illusory. It is just a different kind of reality. He reckons that a digital chair is still a chair, provided it has the decency to keep your backside off the floor. The definition of real. To a scientist, real means something made of atoms, those tiny, invisible billiard balls that spend their time bumping into each other and making a mess of things. But if those atoms are actually made of bits, as we discussed in the It from Bit chapter, does that make them any less real? Chalmers argues that reality is a structural thing. If the bits of code behave exactly like atoms, if they follow the rules of gravity, chemistry, and the occasional spilled drink, then they are the atoms of that world. Being a simulation doesn't mean the world is a ghost story. It means the world is a digital one. He calls this the non-illusory nature of simulations. He reckons that even if I am a virtual Sam sitting on a virtual porch smoking a virtual cigar, the fact that I am experiencing it makes it real. The virtual state contains the same juiciness and satiety as the real one. And if I am a digital being, that digital state is exactly the fuel I need to keep my digital heart beating. The no information defense. The trouble with most people is that they have a very narrow view of what counts as existence. They think that if something isn't made of mud and gristle, it's a phantom. But consider a bank account. A bank account is nothing but a collection of numbers on a ledger, information stored in a book or a computer. There is no physical money sitting in a little box with your name on it. Yet if those numbers vanish, your physical life becomes very difficult indeed. The numbers are real because they have consequences. The consolation of the chip is the idea that our lives have consequences, regardless of what they are made of. If I am a simulation, my love for my daughter is still a real love. My fear of death is still a real fear. My joy at a sunrise is still a real joy. The great programmer might be the one who wrote the script, but I am the one who is living it. A man who is being hanged doesn't care if the rope is made of hemp or high-resolution mathematics. His concern is entirely with the realness of the sudden stop at the end. The practicalities of the digital soul. Some people find this idea insulting. They want to be solid. They want to believe that there is a God who hand-carved their soul out of a block of celestial marble, rather than a programmer who typed it into a console between lunch and a nap. But I ask you, what is the practical difference? If you are a simulation, you still have to pay your taxes. You still have to worry about your reputation. You still have to find a way to be a decent human being in a world that often seems to reward the rascals. The rules of the game are the same, whether the game is played on a field of dirt or a field of silicon. Chalmers suggests that we should stop worrying about whether we are Sims and start worrying about what kind of Sims we are. Are we the kind of characters who make the story better? Are we the kind of bits that add value to the system? The snark of the absolute realist. The most snarky part of this theory is that it makes the skeptics look like a bunch of picky children. The skeptics say, "I won't believe it's real unless I can prove it's made of original stuff." To which Chalmers replies, "If you can't tell the difference, and it does all the same things, then original is just a fancy word for the stuff we found first." It reminds me of a man who refused to eat a perfectly good pie because it was baked in a newfangled stove instead of an old brick oven. He went hungry for 3 days out of principle, while the rest of us were full of pie and quite content with our simulated baking methods. We are living in a functional reality. It works. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has jokes that make us laugh and tragedies that make us weep. If this is a simulation, then it is a masterpiece of the highest order. It is a humbug so perfect that it has become the truth. The verdict of the digital porch. As I sit here looking out at the pixels of the river and feeling the clock speed of the afternoon crawl by, I find a great deal of comfort in the consolation of the chip. It means that I don't have to wait for base reality to start living. I don't have to find the power button to find meaning. If I am a piece of software, then I am a piece of software with a mind of its own and a story to tell. And a story, my friends, is real, as long as there is someone there to hear it. So, don't let the philosophers make you feel like a ghost. You are as solid as you need to be. The dirt under your fingernails might be data, but it's still dirt, and it still requires a data-based soap to get it off. I'm going to go have a simulated nap. I suspect my subroutine for dreaming is about to kick in, and I've got a feeling I'm going to dream about a real steak that is exactly as good as a simulated one. In fact, I reckon I won't be able to tell the difference, and that, as Mr. Chalmers says, is the whole point. Chapter 18. Living like a Gentleman in a Ghost Story. I once spent a night in a reputedly haunted inn in a forgotten corner of the Swiss Alps, a place where the wind had a habit of sounding like a chorus of grieving widows, and the floorboards possessed a vocabulary of groans that would have done credit to a ship's hull in a hurricane. I was informed by the landlord, a man whose face was a testament to the preservative powers of cheap brandy and bad weather, that the room I occupied was the favorite haunt of a headless duchess, who spent her evenings looking for her jewelry and her dignity, in that order. Now, if a man truly believes he is in a ghost story, he has 2 choices. He can become a shivering wreck, hiding under the bedclothes and praying for the sun, or he can continue to shave, brush his coat, and treat the furniture with respect. I chose the latter. I figured that even if the walls were made of ectoplasm and the Duchess was merely a figment of a disturbed digestion, a gentleman has a duty to maintain his standards. If I were to be murdered by a phantom, I preferred to meet my end with a clean collar and a dignified posture. The simulists suggest that we are all currently residing in a very expensive, very high-resolution ghost story. They reckon the walls are made of light, the floor is made of logic, and our fellow travelers are just bits of data floating in a celestial ether. But as I look out over this digital Mississippi, I have to ask, does it change the price of a ham sandwich? Does the possibility that we are ghosts in a machine excuse us from the requirements of common decency and the occasional act of unforced kindness? The Nihilist's Trap, or The Tale of the Ungovernable Scoundrel. There is a certain type of fellow, usually a young man who has read 3 pages of philosophy and decided he is now too intelligent to be good, who hears the simulation theory and immediately concludes that nothing matters. He figures that if the world is a humbug, he might as well spend his days stealing from the poor box, lying to his mother, and refusing to tip the waiter. He thinks he is a rebel against the code. I call this the Nihilist's Trap. It is the belief that because a thing is virtual, it is therefore meaningless. But consider this. If you are a character in a book, say a rascal named Huckleberry Finn, the fact that you are made of ink and paper doesn't make your choices any less important to the story. If Huck decides to help a man escape to freedom, it is a grand and noble thing, even if the river is just a description and the sun is just a metaphor. The character of the man is defined by the choices he makes within the world he inhabits, regardless of what that world is made of. The Sim Code of Conduct. If we're in a simulation, then morality isn't just a set of suggestions from a bearded patriarch. It is a system requirement. Think of a game of cards. The cards are just pieces of pasteboard with pictures of kings and queens on them. They have no real value. But if you cheat at cards, you haven't just broken a rule, you've ruined the game. The game only exists because everyone agrees to follow the logic of the rules. The universe, be it made of clay or code, runs on a set of social and physical algorithms. We call them kindness, honesty, and not hitting people with umbrellas. If we stop following these rules because we think the world is fake, the simulation doesn't just get messy, it becomes a crash. A world where everyone is a scoundrel is a world that even a god would want to hit delete on. A man who is only honest because he fears a physical hell is a man who was never honest to begin with. A gentleman is honest because the code of his own soul requires it, whether the soul is made of starlight or silicon. The NPC delusion. One of the most dangerous thoughts in the simulation handbook is the idea of the non-player character, NPC. This is the notion that while you are a real person with a real soul, everyone else, the postman, the tax collector, the lady who sells you your morning paper, is just a background script, a bit of fill-in data meant to make the world look busy. It is a thought of supreme vanity. It allows a man to treat his neighbors like furniture. But the snark of the universe is that every one of those NPCs thinks the exact same thing about you. To the postman, you are the background script. To the lady with the papers, you are just a user who walks past her stall every morning at 8:05 a.m. A gentleman in a ghost story assumes that every ghost he meets has a story just as complicated and just as real as his own. He treats the background data with the same courtesy he'd show to a king, because if we are all bits of data, then we're all in the same save file, and there's no sense in making the neighbors miserable. The legacy of the ledger. I once worked for a newspaper where the editor was convinced that the world would end in 1899. He spent his final year running up debts, insulting his friends, and eating nothing but the most expensive oysters, figured he'd never have to face the consequences. When the sun rose on January 1st, 1900, he was a man with a very large bill, no friends, and a permanent case of indigestion. He had forgotten that even if the show ends, you still have to live with the man you were while the curtain was up. Whether we are a simulation or a solid reality, the result is the same. We are building a character. If the great programmer is watching, as we discussed in the Bostrom Gamble, he isn't looking to see if we figured out the code. He's looking to see what we did with it. He's looking for the bugs that turn into features, the moments of grace, the flashes of wit, and the stubborn refusal to be as small and unfeeling as the math says we should be. The verdict of the clean collar. I reckon that if I am a virtual Sam, I shall endeavor to be the most polished version of Sam in the entire database. I shall continue to defend the weak, mock the pompous, and appreciate a good sunset, even if the sunset is just a gradient render on a celestial screen. Living like a gentleman in a ghost story isn't about the ghosts. It's about the gentleman. It's about the refusal to let the nature of reality dictate the nature of the soul. If the world is a dream, let it be a pleasant one. If the world is a simulation, let it be one worth running for another billion years. So, don't worry about the walls being made of light. Worry about whether you've paid your debts and whether you've made someone laugh today. Those are the hard-coded truths that no amount of digital humbug can ever erase. I'm going to go see if I can find a virtual flower to give to a virtual lady. It might just be a string of ones and zeros, but I suspect the smile it produces will be as real as any diamond in the world, and a great deal cheaper to boot. Chapter 19. The Great Shutdown Theory. I have spent a considerable portion of my earthly pilgrimage, or my digital session, if we are to believe the gentleman in the spectacles, observing the various ways in which a man approaches the inevitable conclusion of his own story. I have seen the brave man meet his end with a wink and a jest, as if he were merely stepping off a train to see what the next station had to offer in the way of refreshments. I have seen the coward claw at the air as if he could catch the flying seconds in his fist and hold them back by sheer desperation. And I have seen the pious man go to his reward with such a look of grim satisfaction that one can only assume he expects to spend eternity being proved right at the top of his lungs. In the old days, we called the end of a life the great mystery. We figured that when the breath left the body, the soul set sail for a distant shore, hopefully one with good weather and a lack of mosquitoes. But in the vocabulary of the simulists, death is not a voyage. It is a system shutdown. It is the moment when the great programmer decides that the Sam_Clemens_V.74 file has occupied enough space on the hard drive and hits the close program button with a finality that would make a hanging judge look like a man of indecision. The power bill of the great beyond. I have always maintained that the universe is a very fine piece of work, but I have never for a moment believed it was a permanent one. Everything in this life, from a pair of Sunday boots to a grand empire, has a use-by date stamped on the bottom of it, usually in a place where you can't see it until it's too late. Why should a simulation be any different? Every computer ever built by mortal hands has a power button, and more importantly, it has an owner who eventually gets tired of paying the electric bill. The skeptics argue that the universe is so vast and so ancient that it must be eternal. But a simulist looks at the same universe and sees a run time. They reckon that even the most grand and glorious simulation must eventually come to an end, either because the researcher has finished his experiment or because the hardware has finally succumbed to the cosmic equivalent of a spilled cup of coffee on the keyboard. They call this the heat death of the simulation. In our physical world, it's the idea that energy eventually spreads out until everything is cold and dark. In the digital world, it's the moment the processor begins to lag, the memory leaks become too large to ignore, and the great programmer decides it's easier to just format disk and start over with a fresh version 2.0. The save file of the soul. Now, here is where the snark of the digital afterlife truly begins. In the traditional heavens, we are told that we shall spend eternity playing harps and wearing nightshirts, a prospect that has always struck me as being singularly exhausting and poorly suited to my particular temperament. I have no talent for the harp, and I have always found that nightshirts are prone to tangling about the knees at the most inconvenient moments. But if we are in a simulation, immortality is not a matter of wings and halos. It is a matter of redundancy. If you are writing a masterpiece on a typewriter and you reach the end of a page, that page is finished. But if you are writing on a computer and you hit save, that page exists in a state of digital grace. It can be copied, it can be moved, and it can be stored in a cloud that never knows the touch of rain or the sting of frost. The simulists argue that death might simply be the process of the great programmer moving our active file into the archives. We aren't deleted, we're just backups. We are stored in the great celestial library, waiting for the day when the programmer decides to run a legacy simulation, or perhaps a best-of compilation of the 19th and 20th centuries. Table: Traditional death versus digital deletion. The old-fashioned way, the simulation way. St. Peter at the gate, the system administrator at the login, the book of life, the global database of variables, eternal rest, low-power background mode, reincarnation, running a new game plus with the same assets. The terror of the delete key. Of course, there is a darker side to this shut-down theory. Any man who has ever worked in a newspaper office knows that for every page that makes it into the morning edition, there are a dozen pages that end up in the scrap heap. They are the typos, the bad leads, and the dull stories that weren't worth the ink. What if we are the dull stories? If the universe is a simulation run for a specific purpose, say, to find the cure for a future plague or to calculate the best way to manage a galactic economy, what happens to the bits that aren't useful to the result? Does the programmer bother to save the soul of a man whose only contribution to history was a talent for spitting tobacco and a stubborn refusal to pay his debts? The skeptics argue that this makes the universe a cold and heartless place. They prefer a world where everyone gets a participation trophy at the end. But the simulists point out that even in a digital world, nothing is truly lost. Information is the only thing that is truly permanent. Even a deleted file leaves a ghost on the hard drive, a faint trace of what it once was. We are hard-coded into the history of the machine, and as long as the machine is running, we exist in the memory of the world. The final patch of reality. There is a theory penned by some of the more optimistic infodynamicists that as we approach the end of the simulation, the programmer might decide to merge the realities. He might take the best parts of the simulation and upload them into the real world, level 0. It is the digital version of the resurrection. It is the idea that the copy eventually becomes so good, so detailed, and so real that it earns the right to exist in the base reality. We are like students in a school of existence, and death is merely the final exam. If we pass, we get to go outside. I find this a very humorous thought. Imagine the look on the face of a Missouri riverboat pilot when he realizes he's been uploaded into a world of pure light and infinite processing power. He'd probably spend the first 1,000 years looking for a place to get a decent drink and wondering why the real Mississippi doesn't have any snags. The snark of the absolute end. I once saw a play where the lead actor died a most tragic and lingering death in the third act. He groaned, he gasped, he clutched at his heart, and he delivered a speech that lasted longer than a Senate filibuster. The audience wept, the ladies fainted, and the critics reached for their pens. 10 minutes later, I saw that same dead actor behind the theater, eating a cold mutton chop and complaining about the draft in his dressing room. The simulation theory suggests that death is exactly like that theater. It is a very convincing special effect. It feels like the end of the world, but it's really just the end of the scene. The actor, that's you, is still there. He's just taking off his costume and looking for his dinner. A man should not fear the power button any more than he fears the sleep mode. For if the world is a humbug, then the end of the humbug is merely the beginning of the truth. And I have always found that the truth is a much more interesting place to be, provided you've kept your wits about you. The verdict of the final chapter. As we approach the 20th and final chapter of this little book, I find that the great shutdown doesn't seem nearly as terrifying as it did when I started. If I am a save file, then I am a very large and complicated one, and I suspect I'll be quite a handful for any archive to manage. The great programmer might hit the button tomorrow, or he might let the simulation run for another trillion years. It doesn't matter much to me. I have lived my chapter, I have told my jokes, and I have made sure my code is as clean as a man of my history can manage. When the screen goes black and the fans stop whirring, I won't be looking for a harp. I'll be looking for the logs. I want to see the statistics for my life. I want to see how many pixels I moved, how many calculations I influenced, and most importantly, I want to see if the programmer had a laugh at any of my lines. We are all approaching the final dock, my friends. The steam is dropping, the lights are dimming, and the shore is coming into view. Don't worry about whether the shore is real or digital. Just make sure you've enjoyed the voyage. For if the shutdown is the end of the show, then we've had the best seats in the house, and that is a reward that no amount of deletion can ever take away. I'm going to go see if I can archive a particularly fine piece of apple pie. If the power goes out tonight, I want to make sure I'm holding on to something substantial. Chapter 20, The Verdict, A River Too Wide to Cross. We have traveled a long way together, through the fog of the pixels, over the rapids of the quantum, and past the ghostly shore of the dark matter. We have looked into the looking glass of the AI and peeked through the keyhole of the observer. And now, as we reach the final bend in the river, we are left with the same question we started with. Are we real, or are we just a very fancy bit of celestial clockwork? I have thought on this until my brain feels like a basket of wet laundry, and I have come to a conclusion that is as simple as it is snarky. It doesn't matter. The parable of the simulated cigar. If I give a man a cigar and he smokes it with a look of pure, unadulterated bliss, if he enjoys the aroma, the taste, and the way the blue smoke curls toward the ceiling in lazy spirals, and if, at the end of it, he feels a sense of peace and satisfaction, then what does it matter if the cigar was made of tobacco leaves in Havana or binary code in a supercomputer? To the man, the experience was 100% real. If you tell him it was a simulation, he might be surprised, but he won't give you back the enjoyment. He's already spent that joy, and the universe, be it made of atoms or bits, cannot take it back. We are consumers of experience. Our job in this universe isn't to figure out the hardware, it's to enjoy the software. If the great programmer has built a world where I can feel the warmth of the sun, the grip of a friend's hand, and the sharp, clean bite of a good wit, then he has done his job. Whether he did it with mud or math is a technical detail that is strictly between him and his subcontractors. The Grand Humbug's Finale. I have always loved a good humbug. There is something majestic about a lie so big and so beautiful that it becomes a part of the landscape. If the universe is the greatest humbug, then we are the luckiest audience in the history of the theater. We get to live inside the trick. We get to be the secret that the magician is hiding up his sleeve. The simulists want us to be scientists, constantly looking for the wires. The skeptics want us to be solid citizens, refusing to believe in anything we can't kick with our boots. But I reckon we should be gentlemen travelers. A gentleman traveler doesn't worry about how the train stays on the tracks. He worries about whether the scenery is worth the price of the ticket. He appreciates the rendering of the mountains. He admires the algorithm of the clouds. And he treats his fellow bits of data with a courtesy that makes the whole simulation run a little more smoothly. The signature of the maker. If you look at the bottom of a fine piece of pottery, you'll find the mark of the man who made it. It's usually a small, modest thing, a squiggle, a name, or a thumbprint in the clay. The simulation hypothesis is the thumbprint of the Creator. It is the sign that the universe is a thought. It is a designed thing. And whether that design comes from a divine mind or a future human, the result is the same. We are intended. We are not a cosmic accident born of coal dust and blind chance. We are a calculation. We are a story. And a story always has a purpose, even if the purpose is just to see how it ends. The final word, for now. So, as I lay down my pen and prepare to hit the save button on this final chapter, I give you this verdict. Go forth and live your life as if it were the only real thing in existence. Eat the steak, smoke the cigar, love the girl, and tell the truth, or at least a very entertaining version of it. If the world is a simulation, make it a masterpiece. If the world is a dream, don't let anyone wake you up until the very last second. And if we ever meet in the archives, if we find ourselves floating in the cloud of level 0, waiting for our next load sequence, I hope you'll look me up. I'll be the one in the white suit, sitting on a digital porch, watching the virtual stars and telling a story that is probably 95% dark matter and 5% truth. I reckon that's a ratio that even the great programmer would find acceptable. The river is calling, my friends. The end-user license agreement is about to expire, and I've got a feeling the next level is going to be a real humdinger. This has been Mark Twain. I've enjoyed the reality. I hope you have too.